Hi, everybody. Tonight, we're taking a slow, immersive journey back through the marble-clad alleys and incense-hung chambers of ancient Rome. Our story is about a side of Roman life that has often been whispered about, laughed over, or misunderstood, but rarely has it been given the soft, quiet treatment of a bedtime story. This is the tale of what Roman prostitutes actually did all day. Not just the scandals or the myths, but the lived reality. Their mornings, their rituals, their fears, their small hopes, and how they survived in one of the most complex societies history has ever known. This won't be a lurid story. It will be a human one. It will unfold gently, in 24 parts, each like a single candle lighting a dim corridor. And like the best stories told in the small hours, it is meant to be absorbed slowly, as your eyelids grow heavy. So, let's begin. The morning air in Suburra, Rome's most infamous district, carried a particular kind of dampness. It wasn't the freshness of a country breeze, nor the dew that sparkled on patrician gardens. It was something else, a mix of charcoal smoke, fermented wine, boiled cabbage, and the unmistakable tang of sweat. From the upper tenements came the sounds of a child crying. A wheelbarrow creaked past. Somewhere, a rooster had decided to crow long after sunrise. In a narrow alley, half choked by laundry lines and graffiti, a wooden shutter creaked open. A young woman, her name long lost to history, but let's call her Calvina, emerged into the day. Her bed was straw. Her skin bore the faint marks of recent bruises and bites, healed now to purple ghosts. She moved slowly, carefully, as if every step was a small negotiation with her body. Her room, if you could call it that, had one small window and a curtain instead of a door. The walls were cracked. Plaster dust gathered in corners like forgotten confessions. The scent of old incense clung to the fabric. Calvina pulled a shawl over her shoulder, one she had bartered for in exchange for a discounted evening the week before. It had a tear near the edge, but it was soft, and the blue still held its color. She wasn't famous. She didn't work in the luxurious lupanar of Pompeii, where carved phalluses pointed the way for tourists and sailors. Calvina wasn't a courtesan with senators for lovers. She worked from a street-side cell called a cella meretricia, about the size of a pantry, beneath a wine shop that opened late and closed later. Her day, like many others, began not with clients, but with calculation. There were things to clean. The floor, stained with last night's cheap wine, a cracked ceramic cup, a small mirror she treasured and cleaned with the edge of her tunic. There were things to hide. Notes from other women warning of dangerous men, tokens given by past lovers, and once, a coin that glinted strangely and turned out to be cursed, at least according to the old woman who sold herbs 2 stalls down. Bathing was not a given. Public baths charged a fee. She could sneak in during women's hours if she moved quickly and knew the right attendants. But Calvina often washed with cold water from a bucket poured gently over a cracked basin while she hummed softly to herself. A lullaby from childhood, or maybe something she had made up. Outside, vendors began shouting, "Bread, olives, wine watered to half strength." The early morning wasn't for seduction. It was for reconnaissance. Calvina moved carefully through the street, eyes scanning faces. She noted who wore togas, who had coin, who was new to the district. Men with hungry eyes, men with tired ones, and others who would not look at her at all. These were not necessarily the worst. The worst were the ones who smiled too gently. A baker's apprentice passed and nodded to her. She returned the nod. There had been a night long ago when she had shared his bed for warmth. No coin changed hands, just warmth. Not all women who sold their bodies called themselves prostitutes, and not all prostitutes worked the same way. Some waited under porticos, some sang at taverns, some danced. Others worked by appointment only. Some lived alone. Others were owned by men, by brothels, by cruelly beautiful women who spoke Greek and took half their earnings. Calvina was free. On paper, she had once belonged to a trader from Ostia, a man with thick rings and a thicker belt. He freed her with the wave of a hand and a perfunctory kiss. That day she cried more than when he had first bought her. Freedom meant choosing your chains. By mid-morning, she found a place to sit, an overturned basket, still fragrant with figs. She checked the hem of her dress. It needed mending. Her sandals too had worn thin, but she had good teeth, striking eyes, and a laugh that men remembered. A group of young soldiers passed, laughing. One of them stared. Calvina lowered her gaze demurely, then raised it just enough to meet his. A look, a promise, a challenge. That was how it began, not with words, with language far older than Latin. Behind her, another woman leaned against a wall, biting into a plum. Her name was Lucia, older, wiser, covered in rings, some real, some not. She had worked the Subura longer than most. Her mouth always seemed on the edge of a joke. Looking for a philosopher or gladiator today? Lucia asked with a crooked grin. Calvina shrugged. Someone with denarii, hopefully. Denarii are like lovers, Lucia said, licking plum juice from her thumb. They come when you don't want them, and vanish when you do. The two women shared a laugh. It was brief but real. They were competitors, but that didn't always mean enemies. The streets held enough cruelty without adding more. As midday neared, the heat climbed. Calvina moved into the shade, watching the world shuffle past. Slaves with baskets, matrons with veils, children barefoot and wild. Every passerby was a possibility. Every moment, a choice. But Calvina was not always in control of her story. Sometimes her day turned suddenly. A hand from behind, a voice she recognized, a demand made in public, forcing her to pretend she was pleased. Sometimes it was a good day, a client who was gentle, a tip, a meal. Sometimes it was a day she wished would vanish into memory. But always, there was the awareness. She was seen and she was judged. By men who praised her in secret and condemned her in the forum. By women who called her names and wore perfume she could never afford. By priests, by poets, by lawkeepers and lawbreakers. And most cruelly, by herself in quiet moments. As the sun began its descent toward the Tiber, the rhythm of the street changed. There was more laughter now, more wine, more danger, and Calvina, still seated on that fig-scented basket, began to prepare for the part of her day that most people assumed was the only part. But that, dear listener, is still hours away. For now the shadows lengthened, and Calvina watched, waited, and whispered to herself the rules of survival. 1. Smile only when you mean it. 2. Trust no one after dark. 3. Never forget the name of the man who hurt you. 4. Always remember the name of the man who was kind. Would you like me to continue with the next part? The shadows deepened slowly, as if reluctant to swallow the rest of the Roman day. By the time twilight brushed its violet fingers across the rooftops of Subura, Calvina had already counted the denarii she didn't yet have. Her fingers played absently with a frayed thread on her tunic, her gaze no longer scanning the faces that passed, but instead resting quietly on the cobbles at her feet. It was a look that did not invite conversation, but neither did it promise safety. There was a stillness to this hour, just before the lamps were lit. A pause in the city's breath. The forge fires had quieted, the shouting vendors were retreating into their alcoves, and even the dogs, those shaggy, sharp-eyed beasts that haunted Rome's alleys, seemed to slow their restless pacing. Calvina rose at last, the sound of her sandals scuffing against stone marking the only protest her body gave. She moved like someone who knew every inch of the street, where the cracks were wide enough to catch a toe, where the puddles lingered longest, where the shadows could either hide or reveal. Her destination was not a brothel, not tonight, but a bathhouse tucked behind a faded green awning, known to most as Domus Livia. It wasn't the kind of place senators visited. It was cheap, private, and small. Inside, steam curled from the floors, curling up around bare ankles and filling the nostrils with a soft herbal warmth. The women's section of the bathhouse smelled of lavender oil and citrus soap, diluted many times to stretch a single purchase across many clients. Calvina stripped without ceremony, handing her clothes to the attendant, a boy who never met her eyes and never needed to be told twice. Her body was lean and carried the roadmap of her trade. Bite marks faded to brown, thin scars on her thigh, and the unmistakable curve of her hip from a childhood illness untreated. But she carried herself with a dignity that made it impossible to stare too long. She slipped into the water with a quiet sigh, and for a few blessed moments, she was no one at all. The other women whispered. Not about her, not this time, but about a raid the night before. A vigil squad had descended on a brothel near the forum, dragging women half naked into the street, demanding proof of licenses. Licenses, yes. Rome did not just tolerate prostitution, it cataloged it. A meretrix, the legal term, had to be registered. Those who weren't risked punishment, even exile. but enforcement was sporadic and cruelly selective. One woman, older, spoke softly of how she'd hidden under a wine cask. Her breath held so tight her ribs ached. Another mentioned a girl, barely grown, who had wept as her name was carved onto the slate that hung in the watch commander's hall. Calvina said nothing. Her license was valid. It had cost her 2 weeks' wages and a favor she'd rather forget. She kept it folded beneath the loose floorboard of her cell, but still she knew how fast things could turn. After the bath, she rubbed her skin with a cloth until it flushed, then applied a thin sheen of olive oil to her legs and arms. No perfume tonight. Her last vial had shattered days ago. Instead, she relied on soap, skin, and the faint sweetness of a basil leaf she chewed absently for breath. Her lips she reddened with a small pot of crushed berries and wax, a gift from a gallant client who fancied himself an apothecary. Her hair she braided loosely, letting strands fall across her cheek. Not elegant, not formal, but soft. And soft was a look that made some men generous. Back on the street, dusk had taken over. The torches flickered like nervous hearts. Calvina made her way toward the wine shop above, which her cell sat. But she did not enter. Not yet. The owner, a balding, ever-sweating man named Petron, leaned against the doorway, wiping his hands on a stained cloth. He offered her a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Busy tonight?" he asked, voice thick with smoke and vinegar. "Ask me tomorrow," Calvina replied. "New fellow came through this morning," he said. "Looking for someone like you. Paid in advance." She paused. "Did he leave a name?" "No," Petron said, scratching his beard. "But he tipped." That meant she would go. The moment was decided not with drama, but with the weary acceptance of someone who had long ago stopped expecting safety in details. She climbed the narrow stairs to her room. She'd tidy. She'd prepare. She'd wait. The cell smelled faintly of oil and dust. She lit a small oil lamp. Its flame cast shadows that danced along the cracked walls. She arranged the single cushion she had, laid out a cloth on the corner where they might drink. The cup was chipped but clean. Her breath slowed. In, out. In, out. Then the knock came. He was not what she expected. Not drunk, not leering. Middle-aged, neatly dressed. A cloak folded over one arm. His beard trimmed. But there was a tension in his shoulders that spoke of something recent. Grief, perhaps. Or fear. She opened the curtain and stepped aside. He entered. She closed the curtain behind him. There were rules now, ones she would enforce quietly. No shouting. No roughness. Payment first. He sat silent for a long moment, then handed her a small purse. She didn't count it in front of him. She simply nodded. "Do you want to talk?" she asked. The man shook his head. His voice was low. "Just stay with me." Calvina studied his face. There were lines, recent ones. His hands, though calloused, trembled faintly. She touched his cheek, not seductively, just gently. He closed his eyes, and for the next hour they did not speak. No moans echoed through the stone walls. No cries of pleasure. Just two figures, one sitting, one reclining, bound together by a kind of silence only the lost can share. She did not undress fully. He did not press her. They simply were. When he left, he kissed her forehead. And as the curtain closed again behind him, Calvina sat back on her cushion and looked at the coin pouch in her hand. She would eat well tomorrow. She might even buy more perfume. But she would remember this man. The way his sadness entered the room before he did. The way he left it behind when he went. The night was still young. The city still full of men. But for now, she rested. Not asleep, not at ease, but still. In Rome, that was sometimes the closest thing to peace. The air in Subura thickened as night advanced. The scent of smoke mingled now with roasting meat and spilled wine, drifting from tavern doors that had finally flung themselves wide open. Street performers played flutes and struck small drums, coaxing silver from drunk spectators. A woman somewhere sang a ballad, too melancholy for the rowdy backdrop of the street, her voice hauntingly soft beneath the clamor. Calvina stood at her window, just a gap in the wall where plaster had long since crumbled. She watched the traffic of the living and the drunk, of the lonely and the predatory, pass like an endless tide beneath her perch. Her fingers traced the edge of the wooden sill, worn smooth by years of the same quiet ritual. Below, a group of young men stumbled by in a clump, toga hems wet with sewer water. One of them shouted a name, Sulpicia, maybe, or Valeria, but no one answered. Their laughter rose and faded like birds scattering from rooftops. In her cell, she counted the coins from the last client, setting them carefully into the jar she kept hidden beneath the floor plank. It was not much, not enough to dream with, but it would keep her fed, keep the landlord's questions at bay, keep her fingers from trembling when the street grew quiet and the voices turned cruel. She poured herself a small measure of watered wine. It tasted sour. Still, it warmed her chest. She stared at the flame in her oil lamp until her eyes grew heavy, then snapped herself awake. The night was not over. A knock, then another, soft, rhythmic. She didn't recognize it, but she opened the curtain. This one was younger, barely older than a boy. His hair carefully oiled, his breath tinged with garum and figs. Nervous, despite the swagger he wore like armor. A cloak of blue wool, too fine for this part of the city, draped from his shoulders. His hands were soft. No labor there. A noble's son, maybe, or a merchant's heir pretending to be one. Calvina let him enter. He offered no greeting, only a pouch of coins with the top untied, like he'd held it the whole way here, squeezing it like a charm. She poured the contents into her palm, counted quickly, generous. Either he didn't know the rates or he wanted to feel like he was different. Better. She gestured to the cushion. First time? She asked. He looked startled, as if the question was an accusation. Does it matter? No, she said, smiling faintly. Just means I go slower. The boy relaxed slightly, but his eyes darted, room to floor, floor to wall, wall to her. Not lust, not yet. Apprehension. Do you want to talk? She asked. This time, he nodded. They sat opposite one another, cross-legged. She noticed how tightly he held his own knees, as if the air might collapse in on him, as if his skin were thinner than it should be. My father says this place is filth, he said finally, but I wanted to see for myself. Is that what you think it is? She asked, pouring him a drink. He didn't answer. Drank deeply instead, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand like a child. I'm going to marry a girl I've never met, he said. They showed me her likeness. She has a long nose. Calvina nodded slowly. That's how they do it. She's from Ravenna, he continued. She doesn't even speak Latin properly. Then you'll have many quiet evenings, she said. The boy laughed. It was genuine, surprised. I thought you'd pretend, he said. Act like you cared. I do care, she said, but not about your nosy wife. I care whether you sleep well afterward, whether you leave here whole. He stared at her, silent. They made love after that, or something near enough to it. It was not urgent. It was soft. A mutual agreement between two strangers in the dark. When he trembled afterward, she held him, even though he didn't ask. Later, when he left, he placed another coin in her hand. Just one. Gold. She didn't protest. She knew better than to ruin a moment someone else might need to remember. After the curtain fell again, she stayed seated for a long time. The gold coin she slipped into her sash separate from the others. Not because it was more valuable, but because it came with something extra, some quiet confession neither of them had spoken aloud. The street had grown quieter now, fewer footsteps, more voices behind doors, laughter muffled by thick curtains and wine-soaked tables. From a window across the way, a child began to cry. The mother, young, angry, exhausted, shouted at someone in grief. Calvina closed her eyes. That sound, too, was part of the night. Sleep teased her, but she wasn't ready. Not yet. She reached beneath her cushion and pulled out a worn scrap of parchment. Not a letter, not a prayer, just a list. Names, places, little details. The names of men who had been kind, who had tipped well, who had kissed her hand without shame. A way of remembering that not everything had been cruel. She didn't read it, just touched it, gently, then folded it again. Outside, a wind stirred the lamps. A figure passed by the window, pausing briefly to glance up at the glow of her light. Then he moved on. She wondered, as she often did, how many watched her from the dark. Not with desire, not even with judgment, just curiosity. Who was the woman behind the curtain? What life did she live when the curtain stayed closed? She set her cup down, blew out the flame, lay back on her cushion, and waited for her body to settle into stillness. Somewhere in the city, the hour turned, and with it, the life of every woman like her, visible and invisible in turns, shifted slightly, like a boat on a sleeping tide. In the pitch of Roman night, when even the cats curled into silent alcoves and the city's chaos withdrew into a lull of flickering embers and hushed prayers, Calvina stirred. The sleep had been shallow, a fragile layer of rest, easily broken. Not from fear, not anymore. Fear was a thread too often pulled. What remained in its place was awareness. a own sense that came from years of being on the edge, of breath, of safety, of being seen. She sat upright, fingers pressing into the thin bedding beneath her. The room had cooled. Her shoulder ached from where it had pressed too long into the uneven floor. The oil lamp had guttered hours ago, its wick now a cold curl of ash. But outside, Rome moved still, quietly, like a great beast settling in its den. The moon filtered through the jagged opening that passed for a window, its light dusting the far wall with a silver outline. She could hear distant footsteps, perhaps a patrol of vigils, perhaps a drunk poet, perhaps someone looking for something they couldn't name. She rose slowly, limbs stiff. Her dress clung to her thighs with the sweat of sleep. She peeled it away and poured water from a clay jug into a bowl, splashing it onto her face and neck, cold, sharp, grounding. Then, reaching under the same loose floorboard where she kept her coin jar, she retrieved a second item, a small, dark cloth pouch. Inside were tokens, not of love, of memory. A broken ring, a tiny bronze coin worn smooth, a sliver of carved bone, and a scrap of purple thread, the kind used only by the wealthiest, snipped once from the hem of a man who would whisper things into her ear that still woke her some nights, not from dread but from longing. She didn't keep these things because she was sentimental. Not exactly. She kept them because they proved she existed. Outside, a loud thump interrupted the silence, not near but not far. Calvina's eyes snapped toward the doorway, then footsteps, two sets, stumbling, uneven. A woman's laugh, brittle and high, a man's voice, low and hungry. She knew that sound. Another cell, another woman, a night unfolding not unlike her own had many times. She sat back on her heels and waited until the sounds moved further away, dissolving into the city's ribs. She dressed again, a plain tunic, cinched at the waist. She didn't plan to work again that night, but she didn't like to be idle either. Not when the city whispered. Calvina slipped out of her room, closing the curtain gently. Down the stairs, past Petron's wine shop, where two men snored on the steps beside an overturned jug. The air was damp and smelled of yeast and cooling stone. She turned left into a smaller alley, one so narrow that the building seemed to touch above her head, blocking out the moonlight. Here, in the deepest shadows, she walked barefoot, her sandals held by their straps in her hand to quiet her steps. She was going to see Varia. Varia wasn't a prostitute, though she'd once been. Now she was something else. A kind of oracle, a secret keeper, a woman who knew how to read the entrails of fish, who claimed to have once kissed the forehead of an emperor's bastard son before he was poisoned. Varia sold herbs, charms, and the illusion of protection. Her home was a room smaller than Calvina's, but it was full, overflowing with dried bundles of thyme and rue, animal bones strung together, wax figures with pins stuck through their hearts, and in the center always, Varia herself, wrapped in shawls and age. Calvina arrived to find the curtain open and the lamp burning. "You're late," Varia rasped, as if they had agreed on a time. "I wasn't coming, then I was," Calvina said. Varia nodded, as if that answered everything. She motioned for Calvina to sit on the mat, and she did. Varia stirred something in a cracked pot, too dark to be wine, too thick to be tea. "What do you want?" Varia asked. "Not protection," Calvina said. "I want a name." "Whose?" "Mine." Varia raised an eyebrow. "You already have one." "A borrowed one," Calvina said. "A name given by a man I don't remember after another sold me. I want to know the name I would have had." Varia considered this. "Do you believe names have power?" "I believe mine was stolen." Varia set the pot aside and reached for a bowl filled with tiny bones. Bird bones, Calvina thought. She cast them on a cloth, studied them. Her lips moved without sound. Then she looked up. "Amara," she said. "Your name would have been Amara." Calvina, or Amara, closed her eyes. "Does it mean anything?" "Bitter," Varia said. "Or eternal." It felt right. She stayed there for some time, watching Varia tie little pouches of herbs and whisper into them. Eventually, she rose, gave the old woman 2 coins, and left. Not because she believed in magic, but because she believed in meaning. The sky had begun to shift by the time she returned to her cell. The stars were still out, but the eastern edge of the heavens had lightened slightly, just barely. She entered her room, unpinned her tunic, and lay down again. Amara, she thought. A name with roots, a name with edges. She mouthed it into the darkness, then turned her face to the wall. In the softest hours of night before the baker's fires began again, she finally slept. Not Calvina, not a Mirtrix, but someone else, someone older than Shane, someone whose name tasted of both sorrow and survival. By the time dawn began to stretch over the rooftops of Rome, painting the tiled slopes in copper and pale gold, Amara was already awake. She had not risen with the clamor of the city's commerce, nor the bustle of the slave carts. She had risen quietly, before the cries of vendors or the scrape of shutters opening. This hour was not hers, but she had learned to borrow it. The world was gentler before it remembered its business, and in this lull, she moved with a rare kind of freedom. No glances, no expectation, no performance. She did not speak the name aloud. Not yet. Amara. It lived just behind her lips, warm and secret. Names were powerful, yes, but they were also fragile. She wanted to feel it longer before she risked offering it to someone who might not handle it gently. She stood by her basin again, splashing her face with the last of yesterday's water. The scent of her own skin, salt and sleep, mingled with the faint herbal trace from Varia's hut. She considered the coin pouch, heavier than usual thanks to the gold piece from the boy. She would not spend that one. Not for food, not for rent. It would remain in her room like a talisman, proof that even in her world, something could arrive that was not entirely earned through pain. When she stepped out into the street, the Suburra was beginning to rouse. Men with brooms swept the stones with half-hearted motions. A toothless woman stirred a pot over a coal fire, humming an Etruscan lullaby under her breath. A child darted barefoot between two buildings, clutching a stolen apple and laughing with a wild, bright joy that didn't belong to anyone yet. Amara passed them like a ghost. Not unseen, never truly unseen, but not addressed. She made her way toward the slope of the Aventine, a path unfamiliar to many of the girls who worked her side of the city. It was cleaner there, less loud. Patrician homes rose behind high walls, and the roads were swept before sunrise by silent servants whose names would never appear in any poem. But she did not climb for work. She climbed for something older. At the base of the slope, just before the streets turned white with imported marble, stood a small shrine. Not one the senators visited, a simple thing. A stone pedestal, its carvings worn smooth, a statue of a goddess, unnamed, eyeless, arms long gone. Her head tilted as though listening. Amara brought with her a sprig of rosemary and 3 lentils, offerings. Not because she believed in the shrine's power to change anything, but because in a world where so much was taken without permission, she liked to give something freely. She knelt on the stones, her knees pressed into the dirt where 100 others had knelt. She placed the offerings gently and closed her eyes. She did not pray, not in the way temples taught, but she spoke within. Let me not forget the softness of a touch freely given. Let me not grow so hard that I cannot feel the good when it comes. Let my name mean something, if only to me. A wind stirred the rosemary. The city yawned below her. She stayed until her legs began to numb, then stood and wiped her palms against her tunic. On her way back down the slope, she passed a man she recognized, not by name but by gait. He had once grabbed her wrist near the Forum, pressed coins into her hand too roughly, whispered threats sweetened by wine. She kept her eyes forward. He did not recognize her, or if he did, he gave no sign. She had learned long ago that the ones who took most often forgot the faces they'd taken from. Back in the Suburra, the city was fully alive. A group of performers practiced nearby, their voices clashing like cymbals. 2 men argued over fish prices. A woman sold strings of garlic and spat curses at anyone who touched without paying. The streets had become themselves again, sharp, chaotic, unapologetic. Petron at his wine shop waved as she passed. His hand was stained red with juice. His face was greasy with sleep. "You'll work tonight?" he asked. "Likely," she said. "You always say likely," he grunted. "Because the day hasn't told me yet," she said. He laughed at that, a short bark of mirth. Amara returned to her cell. The curtain swayed behind her like a held breath. She reached under the cushion and took out her needle and thread. Her tunic needed mending near the shoulder, a rip too close to the seam. It would tear further if left alone. She worked slowly, with fingers more used to coaxing than sewing. The thread was coarse, the color wrong, but it would hold. That was enough. She didn't need it to be beautiful, just sturdy. Each stitch reminded her of the women who had come before her. Not in her family, she had no memory of them, but in her trade. Women who had bartered kisses for bread, who had loved once and then never again, who had buried children, who had danced barefoot at Saturnalia and wept alone the next morning, who had stitched their clothes with the same deliberate care, even as the world believed they were meant to be disposable. When she finished, she held the tunic up to the light. The seam wasn't perfect, but it was whole. That would do. Outside, a group of boys passed, laughing and elbowing each other, flinging bits of bread into the gutter. One of them glanced up and saw her in the window. He grinned, too young, too fast, and called something crude in Latin. She did not respond. She lowered the curtain and sat in the quiet of her room, cradling the knowledge that somewhere in the city her name waited. Not in stone, not in ink, but in the eyes of someone who might one day see her and speak it gently. Amara. She mouthed it again, then let it rest. Afternoon in Rome was a strange creature, too warm to move quickly, too loud to rest. It hung in the streets like a silk curtain, heavy with dust and the promise of arguments. Sunlight poured in slats between tall buildings, carving lines across worn pavement and bare shoulders. Shadows clung to the corners, narrow alleys where time slowed and sweat pooled. Amara sat on the stoop beneath her cell, legs tucked beneath her tunic, a bowl of lentils in her lap. The dish was warm, laced with garlic and onion, too salty but filling. She ate slowly, letting each bite linger. Food was more than survival now, it was rhythm, anchoring her to the present when memory threatened to drift like smoke. Patron had left a heel of bread on the doorstep. He always did, though he never said why. Perhaps guilt, perhaps pity, perhaps just the small economics of habit. She dipped it into the bowl, savoring the way it softened. Across the street, an old man pushed a cart filled with flasks of watered wine. He sang softly to himself, a Gaulish tune that didn't belong to Rome. His voice wavered like heat on stone. Children darted past him, barefoot and wild, their laughter sharp and quick. They had built a makeshift arena of stones and broken tiles. Two of them slapped at each other with branches, pretending to be gladiators. One called out, "I'm Marcus the Lion! You're dead, dog!" The other shrieked with mock agony and flopped dramatically to the ground. Their joy twisted something in Amara's chest, something she hadn't felt in years. Not envy, not longing, just the quiet ache of distance. She stood and dusted crumbs from her lap. The bowl she set aside on the stoop, covered with a cloth for later. Her body moved without thinking now, the motions of preparation etched into her bones. She returned to her room and removed her tunic, folding it carefully. From a sack beneath her sleeping mat, she pulled out her better dress. It was darker, tighter across the chest, cinched the waist, not elegant. Nothing she owned was, but suggestive enough to draw eyes. The neckline had been carefully altered, the hem resewn after an incident with a drunken sailor's boot. She dressed slowly, each layer a transformation, not into someone else, but into the version of herself the world paid to see. She applied powder to her face, pale, chalky, taken from the bottom of a jar gifted by a client who had fancied himself a philosopher. A touch of rouge to the cheeks, wine diluted, spread with a fingertip. Her lips she painted with crushed berries again, deeper this time. A smudge of ash along the eyelids to make her stare linger. In the quiet mirror of polished tin, she examined the result. A stranger stared back, but not unfamiliar. They had walked this road together many times. From the corner of her shelf, she took out a small vial of oil. It smelled faintly of orange peel and myrrh. She dabbed it behind her ears, on her wrists, at the hollow of her throat. There wasn't much left. She would make it last. By the time she emerged again, the heat had begun to break. A breeze swept through the alleys, tugging at veils and tunics. The scent of roasted lamb drifted from a nearby vendor. Amara inhaled it but kept walking. She wasn't going far. Just to the Via Tecta, where the arches gave shade and men gathered at dusk. They liked the way the fading light made their coins seem brighter, their promises more golden. She took her place near a pillar marked with layers of ancient graffiti, scratched names, crude drawings, poems about gods and lovers and debts unpaid. She leaned lightly against the stone, folding her arms, letting the angle of her body suggest availability without desperation. To her left, Lucia was already present. Draped in a plum-colored gown that clung to her curves, she sipped slowly from a clay cup and nodded at passersby. "Evening, Amara," she said, her tone casual. Amara glanced over. "Busy yet?" A few merchants, one senator's nephew, wanted me to dress like a vestal and pretend to refuse him. Men are so inventive when they feel guilty. Amara smirked. Did he pay more for the shame? Lucia lifted her cup. Shame always costs extra. They laughed softly, the sound lost beneath the thrum of hooves on stone and voices echoing off marble. A man approached, a Roman officer by his attire. His bronze cuirass shone in the twilight, his sandals crisply laced. He had a scar across his lip and the proud look of someone unused to being told no. He paused before the two women, assessing them like livestock. His eyes lingered on Amara. You, with the dark eyes. She met his gaze, steady and unflinching. How much? He asked. For an hour or a memory? She replied. He grinned. I like clever women. That'll cost extra, Lucia murmured behind her cup. The man reached into his belt and held out 3 silver coins. Amara didn't blink. There's a room upstairs, she said. Clean. He nodded. Lead the way. She did. In her cell, the curtain drawn, he removed his armor piece by piece, laying it down with care. She noticed the way his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from fatigue. She touched his arm once, softly, questioningly. Long march? She asked. 16 days. Gaul to Rome, he replied. Then rest, she said. You don't need to prove anything tonight. He looked surprised, then grateful. When he left later, silent and lighter, Amara sat alone by the lamp and listened to the slow trickle of evening deepen into night. She had made enough for bread, for oil, for another week, but more than that, she had felt for a few moments, not like a shadow, but a person. And that sometimes was more than coin. Night had fully settled over Rome now, a thick velvet curtain drawn over the jagged roofs and crooked alleys of Subura. The moon was only a thin white curve tonight, barely cutting through the smoke and torchlight. Lanterns swung on ropes between buildings, casting flickers over faces that darted in and out of view, lit briefly like ghosts before vanishing again into darkness. In her room, Amara sat cross-legged on the floor, a cup of watered wine balanced carefully between her knees. The soldier's presence still lingered faintly in the air. The metallic scent of armor, the crease his weight had left on the cushion. She hadn't changed out of her dress yet. Her skin still carried the warmth of his breath at her neck, the murmur of half-sleep he'd slipped into near the end. He had stayed a while, longer than most. Not for her, perhaps, but for something quieter he needed that had nothing to do with bodies. She sipped the wine. It was sour again. She had become used to the taste of lesser things. From outside came the soft rhythmic slap of sandals on stone. A whistle, then silence. She stood and moved to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peek. Below, 2 figures leaned against a crumbling wall. One was a woman she didn't know, young, thin, new to the street. Her face held that tight-lipped hopefulness that always cracked after a few weeks. The other was a man, older, clean tunic. He spoke to the girl in the quiet, coaxing voice of a practiced buyer. Amara closed the curtain. She remembered her own first weeks. The dizzy mix of fear and control, the mistaken belief that she was making choices, that the coins in her palm meant she was steering the ship. How quickly that illusion had broken. She changed out of her working dress and folded it gently, smoothing the fabric before placing it back into the sack. Her simpler tunic, looser, cotton-worn, hugged her more like a memory than clothing. She lit her lamp again and pulled out the worn tin mirror. In the flickering light, she wiped away the cosmetics from her face. The powder, the ash, the stain. Revealing what lay beneath was a kind of quiet defiance. Let the world see what it had touched, but not destroyed. A knock. She froze. It was not the hour for clients, not the rhythm of a man come seeking a woman. This knock was slower, firmer. She opened the curtain just a crack. It was Lucia. Can I sit? She asked, already stepping in. Amara didn't object. She gestured toward the cushion. Lucia collapsed onto it like a queen returning from war, loosening her shawl and rubbing her temples. Busy night? Amara asked. Lucia gave a hollow laugh. 2 men, one drunk, one poet. The drunk paid double. The poet paid with a promise to write a verse about my thighs. Amara smiled faintly. Will you frame it? If he survives the week, Lucia muttered, then looked up. Do you ever think about leaving? Amara blinked. Leaving where? This, Lucia said, gesturing vaguely around. The city, the work, the rooms, all of it. It was not a new question, but rarely was it spoken aloud. Where would I go? Amara asked. Lucia shrugged. There's a woman in Ostia who sells spiced bread and says she used to work the port baths. Another in Tiber who married a vintner. Some go north, some go mad. And some stay, Amara added. Lucia nodded. Yes, some stay. They sat in silence for a while. A kind of old comfort settled over the room, like dust that chose where to land. I kept a letter once, Lucia said suddenly, from a man who loved me. I never answered it, just reread it until the ink faded. Amara looked at her. Why didn't you go with him? Lucia's mouth curled at the corner. Because love isn't always enough, and I was afraid that without this life, I'd disappear, that without the mirror and the painted lips and the coins, I'd become no one. Amara didn't answer. She understood. Lucia stood, adjusting her shawl again. Don't forget who you are, she said softly. I just found out, Amara replied. Lucia smiled, tired, proud, tender. When she left, Amara sat for a long time with the lamp burning low. Her hands drifted toward the pouch of tokens again. She didn't open it, just felt its weight in her palm. There were places beyond this street, beyond this city, beyond this life. She knew that. But they were distant as stars, glimmering, cold, untouchable. She had built herself within these walls, not as a prisoner, as a person. Someone had once told her, you are a lantern, not a flame. She hadn't understood then, but now, as she watched the last flicker of her lamp lean into the dark, she thought perhaps she did. She did not burn to be seen. She shone because otherwise she would vanish. And for now, that was enough. The next morning arrived on the back of a pale mist, unusually cool for Rome. It crept between buildings, softening the edges of marble and grime alike, blurring the line between elegance and rot. The usual sounds came muted, vendors' cries swallowed by fog, horse hooves dulled against wet stone, and somewhere the quiet clink of a gate being unlatched. Amara woke before full light touched her wall. The air had changed in the night. She felt it before she moved. Something about the quiet pressed different against her skin. Not ominous, not dangerous, just altered. She stretched, slow and stiff. Her shoulders ached, and her wrists bore the faint memory of pressure, where the soldier's hands had once rested. She lay for a moment longer, letting her breath settle into the rhythm of the city below. The fog was still outside when she stepped barefoot onto the street. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and made her way through the haze, not toward the bathhouse this time, but to the southern edge of Subura, where the street sloped toward the market of Livia. It was a place of voices more than sights, bakers haggling, fishmongers calling out deals, women whispering over baskets of bruised figs. Amara passed them all, drawn not by trade but by habit. This was where the city felt most alive, where the rules blurred and everything seemed possible for a breath or two. She passed a stand selling dyed fabrics, the colors muted in the morning gloom. The vendor was a woman with strong arms and a scar across her collarbone. She smiled when she saw Amara. I've got a cloth in red so deep it could shame a cardinal, she said. Make your clients weak in the knees. Amara paused. How much? Too much, the woman said with a wink, but not for you. She reached under the table and pulled out a bundle. The fabric unfurled like a secret, dark crimson, edged in gold thread worn from handling. Amara ran her fingers along it. It felt expensive. It felt like memory. Where did you get it? She asked. The woman hesitated. From a ship docked in Ostia. Some merchant widow traded it for safe passage. Said she didn't want to look rich when she begged the Senate for land. Amara almost smiled. She had sense. She didn't buy the cloth. Not yet. But she held the thought of it in her mind as she moved through the market, a silken weight resting behind her eyes. She found a basket of soft pears and traded 2 copper coins for one. It was small, dimpled with brown spots, but sweet when she bit into it. The juice dripped down her chin. She wiped it away with the back of her wrist. At the far end of the market, a group of young men stood beneath an archway, watching. Not leering, not exactly, but observing the way boys do when they haven't decided whether they admire or resent what they see. One of them whispered to another. Amara caught the word miratrix. She didn't flinch. Let them learn. She turned and walked slowly back through the crowd, head high, posture easy. Her pace was unhurried, the way a woman moves when she's long since stopped asking for space. It was given or it wasn't. She walked anyway. Back in Subura, the fog had begun to lift. Smoke from morning hearths replaced it, drifting from windows where families boiled beans or warmed stale bread. The street musicians were warming up, plucking strings, clearing throats, testing rhythm on stone walls. Patron stood in the doorway of the wine shop, one hand on his belly, the other holding a cup. "You're early," he noted. "So is the day," she replied. He eyed her. "You hungry?" "Already ate." He nodded. "You should come by later. There's a group coming through. From Hispania, I think. Soldiers and traders, looking for strong wine and soft voices." "Are they kind?" she asked. Patron grunted. "They have coin. Kindness is extra." Amara sighed. "I'll think about it." She stepped back inside her room, the curtain swinging behind her. The space smelled of wax and old cloth. She peeled off her shawl and sat on the edge of her mat, rolling her shoulders, easing out the tightness. Her fingers absently traced the lines of a crack in the floor, the way one might trace a vein. She opened her jar of coins. The gold piece was still there. The others were silver and copper, enough for food, for oil, for another stretch of nameless days. From the shelf, she picked up a small square of parchment. Not official, not legal, just a copied verse from an old poem, written in uneven hand. She had taken it once from a lover's coat. He hadn't noticed, or hadn't cared. "Night will come, as it always has, and I will forget the name I bore in daylight." She read it 3 times, folded it, put it away again. Then she leaned back on her elbows and stared up at the ceiling, where a spider spun its quiet work in a crack near the beam. What would it be like, she wondered, to spin something every day that no one ever noticed? To build in silence, to weave and wait. Her eyes grew heavy. The air was still cool. She allowed herself a moment, just one, to rest without being watched, without being wanted, just to be. The city moved beyond her curtain, and inside she breathed in the slow, invisible moment between survival and sleep. That evening, as the streets turned gold with the dying light, Rome vibrated with the particular kind of tension that came just before revelry. The sky glowed with fire-orange streaks, and a warm breeze passed through Subura, curling into taverns, tugging at veils, lifting dust into the hems of togas. This was the hour when appetite stirred. When men of status turned their steps toward the corners of the city, they pretended not to know. Amara stood before her mirror, fastening a bronze clasp at her shoulder. It was shaped like a shell, once polished, now dulled by time and skin. A gift from a sailor who had whispered that she reminded him of the sea. She had never seen the sea, but sometimes she dreamt of it, endless, ungraspable, far. Her dress tonight was the dark one again, the one that held its shape well, that hid fatigue and framed her eyes in the way that made some men lose track of what they were saying. She braided her hair loosely, letting the ends fall like vines over her collarbone. Her lips were stained, her scent subtle, basil and oil, barely there, like a promise. Outside, the streets had begun to swell. Laughter tumbled from taverns in waves, the slap of dice against stone. Music, off-key but heartfelt, pulsed in intervals from a flute behind the bread stall. Drunken voices rose and fell like the tide. Petron caught her eye as she passed. "They're here," he muttered, nodding toward the back of the shop. "Drinking like they haven't in months." She raised an eyebrow. "Hispanians?" he grunted, and loud. Amara slipped through the wine shop and into the dim alcove beyond. The air was thicker here, warm with bodies, wine, sweat. 4 men sat hunched over a pitcher, laughing in that open-throated way of men who haven't seen war in some time, but still carry it like a secret in their bones. One of them saw her first, younger than the rest. Golden stubble along his jaw, a mouth that twitched like it was always on the verge of confessing something. He nudged the man beside him and the others turned. She didn't smile, not yet. She waited. The older one stood. "You're early," he said, though he hadn't seen her before. "Or maybe you're late," she replied softly. The men laughed, surprised. The tension shifted. The golden stubbled one leaned forward. "What's your name?" "Tonight?" she asked. "Or last night?" More laughter. "Tonight," he said, eyes fixed on her. "Amara." He repeated it under his breath, as if testing the weight of it, then motioned to the empty stool beside him. She sat, folding her legs with grace. They poured her wine. Strong, sweet. She sipped and listened. They were soldiers, but not recent, retired or nearly. One had a limp. Another bore a tattoo on his shoulder, faded eagle wings. They had known each other for years, bonded by long marches and colder nights. Now they sold grain between provinces, but when they drank, They still spoke like men with swords. The golden stubbled one was called Dario, not a name she'd heard often, not Roman. My mother was from Massilia, he said. She named me after her brother. He died in a river. Amara tilted her head. How? No one knows, he replied. They found his clothes folded on the bank, as if he planned to return. She said nothing. The silence held. Later, he asked if she would come with him. Just a walk, he said, to get air. She nodded. The others jeered, clapping his back. One muttered something crude in Latin. Dario ignored it. They stepped into the street, and it was like stepping into a different world. The wine shop receded, and with it the noise. The breeze had cooled. The sky had darkened to a deep indigo. A few stars blinked through the haze. He walked beside her, not leading, not crowding. You're not like I imagined, he said after a time. You imagined me? She asked. I imagined all of this, he said. Rome, the streets, the women, but not like this. Disappointed? No, he said. Just surprised. You're not trying to be anything. You just are. Amara stopped walking, turned toward him. Do you want me to be something else? No, he said quickly. Don't change anything. For a moment they stood in the silence between footsteps, between words. His gaze searched hers, not hungrily, not possessively, but curiously, like he wanted to know something he didn't yet have the language for. She took his hand. It was calloused, warm, a little rough at the knuckles. I have a room, she said. He nodded. They walked back through the winding alleys, not speaking. The torchlight flickered as they passed, catching in puddles and on broken tiles. When they reached her doorway, she pulled aside the curtain and let him enter first. Inside, the lamp burned low. She poured water into the basin and handed him a cloth. He washed his hands, his face. She watched the way he moved, slow, respectful, tired. They lay down beside one another, not immediately touching, breathing in tandem. The moment stretched. I don't want anything, he said, just to lie here. She nodded, and so they did. Two bodies on opposite sides of a thin mat. Nothing demanded, nothing paid for yet. Just a shared silence, a thread connecting them across the width of the room. In the distance, the city hummed. Somewhere, a cup shattered. A voice shouted, then fell quiet. But here, the stillness held. When sleep came, it was not deep, but it was honest. And in Rome, that was rare enough to be sacred. Dario was gone by dawn. He had risen quietly, dressing in the shadows, careful not to wake her. Amara only stirred when the soft pull of the curtain broke the room's silence, and by then, his footsteps were already retreating into the narrow alley. She lay still, wrapped in the warm tangle of her shawl and sleep, eyes fixed on the crack above her head where the ceiling beam groaned slightly with the morning chill. She did not wonder where he went. Men like Dario always had somewhere to be, and it was never here. The part of him that had needed to lie beside her in the quiet hours was not the part that would linger when the sun rose. That was the truth of it. And yet, she found herself listening for a sound that wouldn't come. A knock, a voice, the scrape of his sandal. But it was only the city that spoke. Rome had a way of reminding you how small you were the moment you expected anything more. She sat up slowly, her body sore in familiar places. She poured water into the basin and washed, each splash a small ritual, one for the night gone, one for the day ahead, and one to wash away the parts of herself that didn't belong to her anymore. The skin around her eyes felt tight. She rubbed it gently. Her shawl hung by the window, catching the early breeze. The light had a gray quality that morning, thin, cloud-filtered. Somewhere nearby, an argument was breaking out between a fish vendor and a boy who had taken too much. The sounds of the city folded back in with ease, like a blanket shaken out and wrapped tight. She dressed in a simple tunic, unadorned, and left the room barefoot. Her sandals she carried by the straps, her steps light on the cool stones. She didn't plan to work that morning, didn't plan anything at all. But she walked anyway, letting her feet choose the direction. The Tiber, swollen from last week's rain, shimmered beneath a low, milky sky. The riverbank stank, as it always did, of mud and dead things. But there was life here too, children skipping stones, fishermen crouched low and silent, a man singing a lament to no one as he mended a net. Amara stood near the edge of the embankment and watched the water move. She didn't look for reflections. She knew too well that water distorted. But the rhythm of it, the flow, the pull, the swirl, calmed something in her chest. A woman approached from behind her, steps cautious, deliberate. Is it deep here? The woman asked, her voice quiet. Amara turned. She was young, too young. Bare arms, swollen lip, a bruise just beginning to rise at the corner of her eye. Not deep enough, Amara said. The girl nodded. Her eyes were dull but searching. She clutched a bundle under one arm, clothes maybe, or memories. You thinking about it? Amara asked. The girl shrugged. I don't know. Amara stepped closer, her voice gentler now. You from here? The girl shook her head. No. Brought in from outside. Didn't ask me. Amara nodded. She didn't need the rest of the story. Come, she said. You shouldn't be near the river alone. The girl hesitated, then followed. They walked back through a quieter part of the city. Amara bought a roll of bread from a vendor and handed half to the girl, who devoured it without thanks. Hunger has no manners. At the corner near the tenement, Amara paused. You have a name? The girl chewed, swallowed, hesitated. Fenia. Amara repeated it softly. Fenia. She opened the curtain to her cell and motioned the girl inside. Fenia stepped in like someone unused to being offered shelter. Her eyes flicked over the small space, lamp, cushion, basin, floor. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And now, for a time, it was Fenia's too. Amara poured water and gave the girl the basin. Then she sat beside her, watching as Fenia washed her face and arms, wincing at the bruises. There were more than Amara had seen at first. Some old, some fresh. A map of survival. Who hurt you? Amara asked. Fenia didn't answer. You don't have to tell me, Amara said. But if he comes, I'll know what to do. The girl looked at her, not with gratitude, but with something older. Recognition. They had both been through the same gate, just at different hours. Amara reached under her mat and pulled out the small tin mirror. She handed it to Fenia. Look at yourself, she said. Fenia did. That's yours now, Amara said. Not the bruises, the part underneath. For a long while, neither spoke. Outside, the city resumed its rhythm. Carts rolling, dogs barking, priests chanting in the distance. But inside the small room, something different was happening. Something not quite healing, but not quite broken either. Amara stood and began to prepare lentils. She moved slowly with purpose, letting the sounds of water and fire and wood fill the space. Fenia watched her, still holding the mirror. That morning there would be no clients, no coins exchanged, just a shared bowl of food, a few words, and the beginning of something fragile, a quiet kind of mercy. One woman to another. The smallest rebellion Rome would never notice. By mid-morning, the room had begun to warm, sunlight spilling through the gap in the wall and laying a golden stripe across the packed earth floor. Fenia had dozed off, curled on her side, one arm tucked beneath her cheek, the tin mirror resting on the mat beside her. Her breathing had steadied, finally into something soft and even. Amara sat near the threshold, watching the street through the gap in the curtain. The city was fully awake now. Two men argued near a stack of amphorae. A child dragged a dead branch behind him like a chariot. Somewhere, a woman sang off-key as she scrubbed laundry in a basin. Life pulsed in every direction, relentless and indifferent. But within the small circle of her room, a hush held. Amara didn't want to break it, but she knew it wouldn't last. Rome never let anything remain still too long. She reached over gently and tucked the mirror beneath the edge of the mat, then stepped outside, letting the curtain fall soundlessly behind her. She made her way to Varia's hut again, not because she needed charms, but because she needed truth. Not the truth of omens or entrails, but of knowing that someone else remembered how to survive. The old woman was grinding dried mint leaves when Amara arrived. The scent filled the air, sharp and clean. Varia looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. You smell of worry, she said. Amara sat on the low stool near the hearth. There's a girl, young, hurt. She came to me. And you let her in? Varia asked, not as judgment, but as a measure. I couldn't leave her. No, Varia muttered. You couldn't. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rhythmic scrape of stone on stone. Outside, a rooster crowed as though the sun had just risen, confused by the shifting clouds. Varia poured a small cup of water and handed it to Amara. Rome eats people like her, she said, like us. I know, Amara said quietly. You'll have to teach her the rules. I will. Even the hard ones? Amara hesitated, especially the hard ones. Varia grunted, satisfied. She reached into a jar and pulled out a small sachet of herbs. Here, she said, for sleep, for her. There's valerian and a pinch of poppy seed, not too much. Amara took it without question. She's still quiet, Amara added. Doesn't speak much. She's listening, Varia said. They always are, even when they seem gone. Amara nodded. She had been like that once, absorbing everything, holding it in like breath underwater, waiting for the moment it became safe to rise. She thanked Varia and walked back slowly. The streets had shifted in her brief absence. A group of performers now juggled knives in the square, drawing laughter and coin. A pair of legionaries strode past with heavy steps, indifferent to the swirl of activity around them. And behind them, as always, trailed hunger, desperation, desire. When she reached her doorway, she paused. Fenia was still asleep. The mirror was where Amara had left it, and a faint line of drool marked the corner of the mat. It made something twist gently in Amara's chest. Not revulsion, but tenderness. She sat and waited. She didn't wake her. Let the girl sleep. It was nearly noon when Fenia stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dimness. She looked around, then at Amara, uncertain. You're still here, she whispered. Yes, Amara said. Fenia sat up, brushing sleep from her face. Her hair stuck out in soft curls, tangled and wild. She looked younger in that moment, as if the bruises had peeled back to reveal a girl not yet hardened by the city. I thought I dreamed it, Fenia murmured. You didn't. A silence stretched between them. Then Fenia reached for the mirror, looked into it, and frowned. I don't look like myself, she said. You will again, Amara replied. Or someone better. Fenia looked down at her hands. I don't know anything. You'll learn? I'm scared. So was I. They shared bread and lentils. Amara watched how Fenia ate now, slower, more aware. Not guarded, but alert. The kind of alertness that took root deep in the body. The kind that told you when to run, when to fight, when to stay still. Amara handed her the herb sachet. For tonight, she said. It'll help you sleep. Fenia sniffed it, wrinkled her nose. Smells like dirt. It is dirt, but it works. A small laugh escaped the girl, her first. It startled them both. What do I do now? She asked. Now you wait, Amara said. Watch, listen. Don't speak unless you have to. Don't trust anyone unless they've bled for it. Fenia nodded. And later? Later, Amara said, you decide who you want to be, and then you protect her. That evening, as the sun fell behind the rooftops again, painting the city in long golden slants, Amara lit the lamp in her cell. The flame flickered, catching on the girl's profile as she sat cross-legged, the mirror in her lap. There were two women in the room now, one who had been broken and rebuilt, and one just beginning to gather the pieces. And for the first time in many weeks, the room no longer felt too small. The next days came not with any thunderous shift, but with a kind of slow layering, moments built atop moments, like clay patted into shape by a steady hand. Fenia stayed. She slept on the mat beside Amara, at first curled up like something trying to disappear, then later sprawled in the comfort of unguarded sleep. She spoke more, though not often. She asked questions that began with silence and ended in watching Amara's face. Each morning, Amara rose first, fetched water, warmed lentils. She gave Fenia the better portion, not because she pitied her, but because she remembered what it was like to begin again with nothing in your stomach but fear. In the late afternoons, Amara taught her how to braid her hair, how to pin her tunic to flatter the curve of her waist without revealing too much. She taught her how to walk without looking over her shoulder, how to speak with softness and strength. Not just for men, but for the city, which always listened for weakness. Speak like you're not asking to be heard, she told her, and they'll listen twice. Fenia absorbed it all, nodding, mimicking, fumbling, and correcting. Lucia visited once, catching sight of the girl and raising a sharp eyebrow. You've adopted a stray, she said, sipping from a cup of honeyed wine. I remember being one, Amara replied. Lucia studied Fenia for a long moment, then nodded. She has the eyes, not dead, just tired. She'll need time, Amara said. Lucia smirked. Time is a luxury we don't often get, but if she has you, she might last. The words warmed something in Amara, though she didn't show it. Lucia was not generous with praise. When she gave it, it was like being handed a rare fruit, unexpected and strangely sweet. That night, Amara didn't work. She stayed in the room with Fenia, who asked to light the oil lamp herself. She was proud of how steady her hand was. The light caught her face and softened the bruises. They played a game with pebbles on the floor, drawing little marks in the dust. Lines, circles, a code they made up as they went. They didn't speak much, but the rhythm of the stones, the movement of fingers through dust, filled the space between them like a lullaby. A few days later, Amara returned to the street, not because she needed coin, though she did, but because something in her felt ready again, the part of her that could stand beneath a torchlit archway and hold a man's gaze long enough to make him feel seen, not loved, not needed, just witnessed. That was often enough. She wore the dark dress again, pinned with a bronze shell. Fania stayed behind, wrapped in a clean tunic Amara had traded for with a baker's wife in exchange for a night of listening. Not working, just listening. The woman had spoken for hours, pouring out her grief over a husband lost to debt and a son lost to wine. Amara had said little, but in the end, she left with a bundle of cloth and a strange sense of peace. Now, as she walked through the familiar alleyways, past the wine cellars and dice players, Amara felt herself moving not as a ghost, but as a shadow with purpose. The kind that knows when to stretch long and when to disappear. The first man who approached was too loud, too quick with his hands. She turned him away with a flick of her wrist. The second was better. A traveler with weary eyes and a slow voice. He said he missed his wife, though she was still alive, just far away. "I'm not her," Amara said softly. "I know," he replied, "but you're here." She brought him back to the room. Fania had gone to Varia's for the evening, to grind herbs and hear stories about gods who bled and women who turned into trees. The traveler undressed with reverence, folding his tunic as if it were part of a ritual. "I don't want to talk," he said. "Then don't," Amara whispered. What followed was not passion, it was not love, but it was careful. And when he left, he kissed her hand. "Thank you," he said, as though she had granted him something more than flesh. When Fania returned later, she brought with her a sprig of lavender and a pouch of valerian root. "For your dreams," she said. Amara touched the lavender to her cheek. "And yours?" Fania hesitated. "I didn't dream last night. I think that's the best kind." Amara smiled. "It means you're resting." That night, they lay side by side again, the oil lamp flickering low. "Do you ever want to leave Rome?" Fania asked suddenly, her voice a whisper meant only for the air between them. "Yes," Amara said, "often." "Why don't you?" Amara turned her head toward the cracked ceiling. "Because I want to leave as someone else, not as the girl they tried to break." Fania was quiet a long time. "I want that too," she finally said. The oil in the lamp burned down. The flame thinned, wavered, then vanished. In the dark, their breaths found rhythm again. Outside, the city sighed in its sleep. But in the room, two women breathed like they had begun to write a different ending, slowly, one word at a time. Morning in Sabura carried a sound different from the rest of Rome. It was not the clang of forge or temple bell, but the more subtle, layered noise of survival. Curtains being tied back with weary fingers, sandals slapping stone in practiced haste. The creak of old shutters protesting yet another day. And beneath it all, the murmurs of people waking not from rest, but from delay, because sleep in this part of the city was never truly safe, nor deep. Amara stirred before the sun reached her wall. Fania lay beside her, still cocooned in sleep, her hand curled beneath her chin. The bruises had begun to yellow at the edges, fading like ink left too long in the rain. Her breath was steady now. She didn't jerk awake anymore. Amara rose quietly, pulling her shawl around her shoulders and stepping out into the street. The light was soft, still blushing. She walked to the fountain at the end of the alley, where women gathered at this hour, when the heat had not yet curled the stones and the men were still shaking off wine. She filled her jug, nodded at an old washerwoman who sat on the ledge, humming as she scrubbed a child's tunic. "You're up early," the woman said without looking. "Some things are easier before the city speaks," Amara replied. The woman laughed dryly. "Rome never stops speaking. It only lowers her voice." Amara smiled and walked back. Fania was awake when she returned, sitting up on the mat with her legs crossed, blinking sleep from her eyes. "There's water," Amara said, setting down the jug. "Still cool." Fania nodded, rising to splash her face. She didn't complain about the chill. She hadn't complained once since arriving. That day, they worked together. Not in the street, not yet for Fania, but in smaller ways. They cleaned the room, airing out the linens, folding the tunics. Amara showed her how to boil water with dried mint for scent, how to scrub the basin with ash and peel. She spoke softly, explaining each task not as a chore but as an act of control, of claiming space, however small. You'll need to learn how to keep yourself in pieces, she said, and how to gather them again when the night ends. Phinia nodded, eyes dark and steady. Later they went to the market. It was busier than usual, the streets clogged with merchants from the north. A festival of some kind was approaching, the kind that brought coin but also chaos. Decorations were being hung across shop fronts, ribbons, painted pots, wreaths of olive and myrtle. The air smelled of sweet wine and sweat. Phinia stayed close, one hand lightly grasping Amara's shawl. Her eyes darted from stall to stall, absorbing everything, the colors, the tones of voice, the way deals were struck and denied. Amara bought a loaf of barley bread and 2 pieces of dried fig. From another stall, she chose a skein of red thread, bright red, not for sewing, for protection. They sat beneath a shaded arch to eat. Do you believe in charms? Phinia asked, chewing slowly. I believe in what people need to believe, Amara replied. And if a red threeps your steps lighter, then yes, I believe. Phinia looked down at her wrist as Amara tied the thread there in a single knot. Don't take it off, Amara said, even when it fades. A group of girls passed them, older, painted, laughing too loudly. One of them paused to look at Amara. Well, look at you. Found yourself a shadow? Amara met her gaze. A shadow grows long in the right light. The girl sniffed and walked on. Phinia watched her go, then turned to Amara. Do they know you? They know who I was. Do you miss her? Amara tore a piece of bread. No, I only miss what she thought was possible. When they returned home, Phinia sat by the window, watching the street. She no longer flinched when men passed, though her gaze still dropped when they looked her way. But she watched. She was learning. Amara began mending one of their tunics, stitching with slow, careful movements. Each pass of the needle was steady, thread pulling through cloth like a quiet declaration. I am still here. Phinia turned from the window after a while. Will I ever feel clean again? She asked, barely above a whisper. Amara didn't look up from the cloth. Clean is a word for people who've never been dirty, she said. But you'll feel whole. That I can promise. And for a while they sat in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't demand anything. The kind that lets you gather your breath, your strength, yourself. Outside, Rome sang her afternoon song. Sellers crying their prices, carts rattling, children chasing chickens through alleyways. Life, raw and unrelenting. But in their room, beneath a ceiling that cracked and whispered in the heat, 2 women stitched their small corner of the world back together. Not clean, but whole. Evening came on the heels of thunder. At first, it was just a flicker in the far western sky. A soft rumble so distant it could have been the rolling of a wine barrel. Rome heard it, felt it. The breeze turned colder. The sky lost its golden hue and faded into steel. Torch flames fluttered uncertainly. Vendors began closing their stalls earlier than usual, covering baskets with cloth, pulling shutters tight against what was coming. In the small room beneath the wine shop, Amara sat by the lamp, turning a coin between her fingers. It was old, so worn the emperor's face had nearly vanished, but it was still enough to buy food, or oil, or silence. Phinia sat opposite her, legs tucked under, watching the curtains sway in the breeze that snuck through the wall's cracks. The scent of approaching rain crept in with it, dust and water and iron, something older than the city itself. Will it flood? Phinia asked. Not here, Amara said. The Tiber will swell, but we're too high. Phinia nodded. She had braided her own hair that afternoon, and though the plaits were uneven, Amara hadn't corrected her. It wasn't about perfection. It was about trying. Thunder grumbled again, closer now. Amara stood and went to the shelf. Pulling down the extra blanket they rarely used, she handed it to Phinia. It'll get cold. You're not cold? I've lived through colder things, Amara said. The rain arrived suddenly, like it always did. No polite tapping, no hesitation. It slammed against the tiled roofs, poured into alleyways, filled bowls left outside by the poor hoping for clean water. People shouted and ran, laughter rising in surprised bursts as they darted beneath arches and over puddles. The scent of wet stones spread quickly, a mingling of rot and renewal. Amara pulled the curtain aside and watched. In the street below, 2 boys splashed barefoot through the water, chasing each other, and laughing like the gods had just invented joy. A dog barked once, then disappeared under a stall. A man in a green cloak cursed as his sandal was sucked off by the rising mud. Then came the music. Somewhere, perhaps from the tavern down the way or the shadow of a colonnade, a flute began to play. Slow and low, the notes uncertain at first, like the musician wasn't sure whether the rain would steal the sound. But it didn't. It carried it. The notes rose and curved through the air, soft and mournful. Not a song for dancing, a song for remembering. Amara closed her eyes. Fenia moved closer. Do you know this one? Yes, Amara said, voice barely audible over the rain. They play it at the end of funerals, but some play it for lost lovers. Which is it for you? Neither, both. They sat together by the window, listening. The room was darker now. The lamp's flame stuttered. The walls seemed to lean closer, as though the storm had pressed its palm gently against the city, and Rome, in return, had bent into it. I had a sister, Fenia said suddenly. Amara turned to her. She was older, not by much. When we were taken from our village, she fought. She clawed at them, bit one so hard he bled for days. Amara didn't interrupt. They separated us. I didn't see her after that. I don't know where she is. Fenia's voice didn't shake, but her hands twisted in her lap. I think she's dead, she said. Or worse. Amara reached out and covered Fenia's hand with her own. Then we'll remember her, she said. Whatever happened, we'll carry her. Fenia looked up. Do you remember anyone? Too many, Amara whispered. More than I want, fewer than I should. The rain drummed harder. Water began to trickle in under the doorway, a slow, silvery snake that wound its way toward the center of the floor. Amara rose and placed a pot beneath the leak in the ceiling, then stuffed cloth into the bottom seam of the curtain. She moved with practiced ease, her body following patterns it had repeated through many storms. Fenia watched, then got up and helped. Together, they sealed the room as best they could. It was a losing battle. Rome leaked from every crack, but it was the fight that mattered. Later, when the storm softened, Amara lit a second lamp. They played the pebble game again, drawing lines in the damp floor with sticks. Fenia won twice. Amara pretended to be annoyed. Fenia laughed, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in hours. Do you ever think about a life where we didn't end up here? She asked. Sometimes, Amara said. What do you see? Amara paused. A small house with a garden, chickens, maybe a boy who brings water from the well without being asked. Fenia smiled. That sounds nice. And yours? Fenia closed her eyes. Books. So many books I'd forget how many I had, and time to read them, and a room with a window bigger than my arms could stretch. The storm faded into a steady drizzle. They curled up under the shared blanket, the floor still damp beneath them, but warm enough. And as they drifted towards sleep, Amara whispered, one day, when the coins are enough and the road is clear, we'll go. We'll find the chickens, and the books, and the window. Even if we're old? Fenia asked, voice heavy with sleep. Especially if we're old. The room sighed with them. The oil lamp burned low, casting their shadows together on the wall. Two figures close, unmoving, wrapped in cloth and silence, and a kind of love that had nothing to do with wanting, only staying. And outside Rome slept, but not in peace, never in peace, only in pause. The rain left behind a Rome rinsed but not clean. Streets glistened with puddles rimmed in soot. Rubbish clung to corners, soft and swollen. Roof tiles steamed in the early sun, releasing warmth like breath from a sleeping beast. The gutters ran with murky trails, water winding between broken stone like it had secrets to carry, stories to drown. Amara stood barefoot in the doorway, her arms folded beneath her shawl. The air was thick with petrichor, damp earth, wet wood, the faint sweetness of mold blooming on forgotten bread. She watched a man drag a cart through the sludge, wheels sticking, curses louder than the crows overhead. Behind her, Fenia swept the room with slow, methodical strokes. The broom was short, its bristles worn to stubs. Dust clung to the corners like it had survived worse than rain. You missed a spot, Amara said without turning. Fenia paused. I was coming back to it. Amara smirked. Don't let the corners turn into cities of their own. They already have, Fenia muttered. The rain had done little to cleanse the weight inside them. It had been a long night. Amara had dreamt again, of corridors too narrow, of voices too loud, of hands pulling her down into velvet darkness. She woke with her jaw clenched and her throat dry. She hadn't told Fenia. Some dreams were better left to evaporate with the dawn. That morning, they cleaned everything. Not because they had to, but because order was the closest thing to safety. Amara wiped every surface, polished the brass cup with an old rag until it gleamed like it remembered being precious. Phenia scrubbed the basin. They hung the damp shawls over the window's edge and watched them flutter like quiet flags of their small republic. Around midday, Patron called up from the street. Visitors coming through? Big ones. The kind with teeth and wine. You want to work? Now's the time. Amara glanced at Phenia. The girl met her eyes. Go, I'll stay. You sure? Phenia nodded. I'll walk to Varia's later. She said she'd show me how to mix the sleeping herbs. Amara picked up her dress, the one with the red thread sewn into the hem, the thread Phenia had given her on the second morning they woke under the same roof. She changed quickly, pinned her hair up, added a trace of berry to her lips. It wasn't transformation, it was preparation. Armor, not illusion. Downstairs, the wine shop was already humming. The men were as Patron had promised, loud, broad-shouldered, eyes quick. Traders from the southern provinces carrying salt and stories. One was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. Another had a laugh that sounded like it had been broken once and mended wrong. They smelled of citrus and leather and the particular arrogance of men who never counted the cost of their own survival. Amara walked in with her usual grace, not seductive, not eager, just present, whole. One of the men, the one with the laugh, noticed her first. You charge by the hour or by the dream? He asked. By the kind of man you are, she replied. The table erupted in laughter. Coins clinked, the mood shifted, the rest unfolded as it always did. She sat beside him, let her fingers brush the rim of his cup. He leaned closer, told her a story about surviving a storm at sea, about the way the sky went white just before the wave. She listened, asked questions, touched his arm once, enough to make him feel seen. They didn't leave the wine shop. He didn't ask. He only wanted to talk, to be listened to pretend. When he handed her the coin, she almost didn't take it. But she did. By the time she returned, the sun had dipped low and the air had turned heavy again, as if another storm might crawl across the rooftops before nightfall. Phenia was sitting on the step outside their room, knees drawn to her chest, cool, watching the sky. She came today, she said as Amara approached. Who? The Greek woman, from the alley with the painted vases. Cassia, Phenia nodded. She asked me if I was yours. Amara sat beside her. And what did you say? I said no. I said you were mine. The answer landed like a stone in Amara's chest. Heavy, true. She warned me, Phenia added. Said women like us can't afford to be soft. Said if I wanted to survive, I had to learn to make others small. Amara tilted her head. Do you believe her? Phenia was quiet for a long time. I think I want to be kind more than I want to be powerful, but I don't know if I'll get to choose. Amara reached out and placed her hand gently on Phenia's back. You will, she said, but the choice might cost you. They sat in silence until the stars began to prick the sky. No lamps yet, just the growing hush of twilight. The street below was quieter than usual, as if the buildings themselves were listening. Inside the room, the herbs Phenia had brought from Varia hung above the mat, drying. Their scent, sharp, clean, slightly bitter, filled the space like incense in a forgotten temple. That night, they didn't play the pebble game. Instead, they lay side by side, facing the cracked wall, their backs warm against the last breath of the day. And outside, Rome did what Rome always did. It watched, it waited, and it turned its face away from anything that looked too much like hope. The next morning came with heat. Not the gentle warmth of spring, nor the dry breath of late summer, but the thick, clinging weight of a day that had not yet fully begun and already felt too close, too heavy. Even before sunrise, the walls sweated. The air in the tenement rooms curled inward, dense and unmoving. Amara awoke with a fine sheen of moisture along her temples and neck. She blinked slowly, unsure whether the light filtering in was from the sun or simply the glare of another sleepless night folded in on itself. Phenia was already sitting up, her tunic clinging to her back, hair tousled and damp. It's too early for this, Phenia muttered, pressing her palms to her cheeks. Amara nodded, wiping her face with the edge of her shawl. The gods are bored. They like to watch us sweat. She stood and opened the curtain wider, letting in air that wasn't cooler, just louder. The sound of buckets sloshing, chickens fussing, and a merchant somewhere shouting about spoiled olives. A child sobbed 2 floors above. Somewhere far off, a hammer struck stone in rhythmic bursts. The room had held the night too long. It smelled of sleep, herbs, cloth, breath. "Come," Amara said, "let's find water." They took their empty jugs and wove through the narrowing lanes of the district, half stepping over puddles that had not yet dried from the rain 2 days prior. The streets were already restless. A man cursed the gods for the price of onions. 2 women argued near the fountain, fists on hips, their quarrel weaving in and out of Latin and Oscan like a dance. Fenia held her jug close. Her eyes followed everything. She was learning not just to look, but to see. At the fountain, they waited their turn. An old woman with a crooked spine dipped her bowl into the stream and muttered, "Every year it gets hotter. Rome wants to cook us in our own bones." Amara offered a wry smile. "Let her try." When they returned, jugs heavy, their hands red from the handles, the room felt no cooler. The walls, once comforting in their enclosure, now seemed to press inward. Amara fetched a cloth, dipped it in the water, and pressed it to the back of Fenia's neck. The girl closed her eyes and exhaled. "You have to listen to the heat," Amara said. "It speaks." "What does it say?" "Slow down, or I'll swallow you." That day, they did not go out again. They stayed inside, stripping down to thin tunics, their legs stretched across the mat, sharing a single peeled fig between them. The fruit was soft, nearly fermenting but sweet. It clung to the fingers. Amara rummaged through the cloth pouch beside her sleeping mat and pulled out her collection of tokens, things she hadn't shown Fenia before. Fenia leaned in. "What's all that?" "History," Amara said. "My own kind of archive." She placed each item gently on the mat between them. The sliver of carved bone, the broken ring, the smooth coin, a scrap of faded ribbon, the piece of purple thread. Fenia reached for the thread. "Is this what they use for senators? Or the ones who pretend to be?" Amara said. "It was once sewn into the hem of a man's toga. He told me I reminded him of a painting. I told him he reminded me of someone who needed to be reminded he was still human." Fenia laughed softly. "Did he tip well?" "Better than most," Amara said. "And he cried when he left." The girl touched the broken ring. "Was he important?" Amara's face didn't change. "No, but I was for a moment to him." They laid the pieces out like stones on a path, each one a memory notched into the fabric of her life. Fenia added nothing. Not yet. But her gaze lingered long on the smooth coin, as if it contained a shape she half recognized. The afternoon passed in slow silence. Outside, the city had quieted beneath the weight of the heat. Even the birds stilled. Only the occasional groan of a passing cart or the whimper of a restless dog broke the hush. Fenia dozed briefly, her head on Amara's thigh, her breath slow and warm. Amara didn't move. She sat with the stillness of someone who had long ago learned the value of holding peace when it found her, no matter how briefly. When Fenia woke, the shadows had shifted. "I dreamed I was someone else," she murmured. "Were you better?" Amara asked. "No," Fenia said, "but I was free." Amara stroked her hair. "Hold on to her, even if she's not you yet." That evening, as dusk settled over the city like a hand on the shoulder, Amara braided Fenia's hair. Not for work, not for men, just because it helped the night feel less wild. They lit no lamp. Instead, they watched the dark rise and listened to the low hum of Rome outside their curtain. Inside the room, heat lingered, but it was no longer cruel. It was just another weight they carried together. That night, sleep came slowly. The air in the room refused to move, thick as wool, curling around ankles and pressing into chests. Amara lay with one arm thrown over her forehead, the other draped across her ribs. Fania had shifted 3 times, twisting the blanket, then finally kicked it off altogether, sweat glistening at her temples. Neither of them spoke. There was no point in cursing the heat. Rome never listened. At some time past midnight, when even the cicadas had grown tired of their own music, a soft noise drifted in through the cracked wall. A single, low-pitched tune on a panpipe played slowly, almost tentatively, as if the musician was remembering it note by note. It was coming from the alley just below their window. Fania turned onto her side. "Do you hear that?" Amara didn't move. "Yes." "Do you know it?" Amara nodded against the floor. "It's a shepherd's lullaby, the kind they sing in the hills outside Praeneste. I haven't heard it in years." "Who would play that in this part of the city?" "Someone who remembers home." They lay quietly again. The tune went on for a few minutes, then faltered, then stopped. No applause followed, no voice, just the city humming softly in its 1,000 rooms. The next morning arrived in strips of yellow light, piercing through the gaps in the curtain like fingers prodding at sleep. Amara rose first. Her body ached, not from labor, but from rest that came too shallow. Still, she moved with ease, fetching water from the jug, soaking the edge of a cloth and pressing it against the back of her neck before passing it to Phenia. Phenia sat up slowly, accepting the cloth without a word. Her eyes were puffy, not from tears but from the weight of heat and dreaming. You slept? A little? Bad dreams? No, just long ones. Amara stood, shaking out her shawl and folding it over one arm. Today we find new sandals. Phenia looked down at her feet, dusty, the strap of her left sandal tied hastily with a piece of linen. We don't have to. Yes, Amara interrupted. We do. You can't walk through this city looking like you've already lost. They ventured out just as the first wave of sun climbed past the rooftops. Already, the city shimmered with heat rising off the stone. A line of donkeys brayed as they were led past, their hooves clacking in a slow and as mournful rhythm. A vendor poured wine from a clay jug into a cup, its trickle catching the light like liquid gold. The sandal seller sat beneath a canopy at the edge of the market, a thin man with inked arms and fingers stained with dye. His sandals were laid out in neat rows on a woven mat, leather of all kinds, from soft lambskin to rough oxhide, some dyed green, some left bare. He looked up as they approached. For you? He asked Amara. For her, Amara said, motioning to Phenia. He looked Phenia over with the practiced gaze of a merchant, eyes flicking from her ankles to her eyes, not lecherous, just measuring value. What's your trade? She's learning, Amara said. The man nodded, unbothered. First pair's important. Why? Because it tells the street how you carry yourself. He handed Phenia a pair, soft leather, double-stitched soles, wide straps. Try these. You'll need something that lets you run if you have to, but doesn't make you look like you're running. Phenia slid them on. They fit snugly, the leather hugging her feet like they'd already begun to remember her shape. Amara bartered with quiet confidence. 2 nights' coin, but the good kind. The kind that came with gentleness, not bruises. The seller wrapped the old sandals in cloth and handed them back. Keep them. You'll need to remember where you started. Back in the alley, Phenia walked ahead for the first time. Her steps were still cautious, but her back was straighter. Her arms swung just slightly. Amara watched her with a quiet satisfaction. Later that day, as the sun reached its peak and the streets turned to mirrors, they stayed inside. Amara taught Phenia how to lace the sides of her tunic for work, tight enough to shape, loose enough to breathe. They practiced posture, turns, the pause before a smile. Your hands, Amara said, guiding Phenia's wrist. Never point, never claw. Use them like they're part of your voice. I don't like being touched, Phenia murmured. Then don't let them, Amara said. There are other ways. She demonstrated with her eyes alone how a glance over the shoulder could lead a man without ever letting him close. How to stand with 1 foot back, always ready to step away. How to use silence like a blade. Phenia watched closely, mimicked, failed, tried again. By evening, the city glowed in a haze of copper and smoke. A red sun lowered itself behind the roofs like it had grown tired of watching Rome. That night, Phenia asked to go with Amara. Just to stand, she said, to see. Amara hesitated, then nodded. They stood beneath the portico near the wine shop, just outside the reach of torchlight. Amara leaned against a column. Phenia stood beside her, hands clasped loosely in front of her, watching the way men moved, how they lingered, how they turned back when they thought no one was looking. They want something before they even know what it is, Amara whispered, and they're afraid of needing it. A man passed them, slowed, smiled, then walked on. Phenia didn't flinch. Amara smiled. Good. They stayed only a short while, then returned home. Inside, the room was cool again, as if it too had been holding its breath all day. Phenia sat on the mat, unlacing her sandals, her movements precise. Tomorrow, she said, not looking up, I want to try walking alone. Amara didn't respond right away. Then simply, I'll be behind you, but not too close. And in the quiet that followed, something shifted, not between them, but within them both. A girl becoming a woman, and a woman, perhaps for the first time in years, daring to believe in what she was helping build. The morning light was merciful, soft, golden, dusted with the hush of early dew still clinging to the leaves that grew between cracks in the brick. Rome, for once, seemed to rise gently. No shouts, No carts rattling like bones across the stones, just the low murmur of a city remembering itself slowly. Fania stood by the threshold, dressed in a pale linen tunic with a cord tied at the waist. Her new sandals were already laced. Her hair had been braided neatly down her back, a ribbon woven into it. Nothing extravagant, just a mark that she had taken the time, that she had meant to be seen. Amara sat on the edge of the mat, sipping water from a shallow cup, watching the girl the way one watches a pot just before it begins to boil. Not impatient, but aware that something is about to change. "You don't have to do anything," Amara said gently. "You can just walk." Fania nodded once, her chin steady. "I know." Amara stood, brushed off her shawl, and followed at a short distance, just as she'd promised. They made their way toward the Forum Suburanum, where traffic always converged by mid-morning. It wasn't the grandest corner of Rome, not the Senate steps or the opulent stretches of marble on the Palatine, but it was alive. Bakers yelled from behind smoky stalls, children chased each other around stone columns, and travelers brushed shoulders with merchants, slaves, freedmen, thieves. Fania stepped into the flow with care. Her arms didn't cross over her chest. She didn't shrink. She walked with small, purposeful steps. She didn't yet know how to glide, not the way the seasoned women did, but she moved like someone who belonged, not above, not beneath, just among. Amara hung back, letting the distance grow, her shawl pulled loosely around her shoulders. A few men looked her way, then passed her toward Fania. A few women too, older, measuring the way wolves assess a new creature in their territory. One of them, tall, with gold earrings and an embroidered belt, stepped toward Fania. Amara tensed, but the woman only looked at Fania up and down, then said, "Pretty ribbon. First day?" Fania hesitated. "I'm walking." The woman smirked. "You'll be running soon." She turned and walked away, braids swinging like a whip behind her. Fania glanced back, searching the crowd. Her eyes found Amara. A flash of uncertainty crossed her face. Amara gave the faintest nod. Fania turned forward again and kept walking. She passed a man seated on a crate, sharpening a blade. Past a boy leading a goat on a frayed rope. Past a blind singer chanting verses to an audience that didn't stop to listen. She didn't flinch. She didn't hurry. After a time, she looped back. When they reached the quieter alley near their tenement, Amara caught up and said nothing. They walked side by side in silence until they reached their doorway. Inside, the room was cool, dim, waiting. Fania sat on the mat and unlaced her sandals slowly. "That woman with the belt," she said. "She looked at me like I was meat." "She was meat once," Amara said. "Now she's the butcher." "She made me feel like I didn't know anything." "You don't," Amara said calmly. "Not yet. That's not weakness. That's the beginning." Fania nodded, absorbing it. "I didn't talk to anyone," she added. "You didn't have to." "But they looked at me." Amara met her eyes, and Fania took a breath. "I didn't feel small." That's more than most manage on their first day. They didn't speak more of it. Not because it didn't matter, but because they knew it mattered too much. Words would come later. For now, it was enough that Fania had walked and returned. Later, Amara went out alone. She worked a short hour, an older client, familiar, predictable, one she could handle without performance. When she came back, Fania had boiled water, scrubbed the mat, set out 2 figs on the clay dish. "You cook for me now," Amara teased. "Only if you keep coming back with your coin." Amara smiled and sat down. The evening passed in the rhythm they had built between them, quiet, unforced, shaped by shared breath and overlapping silences. As dusk closed around them, Fania looked up from the bowl she was rinsing. "I think tomorrow I'll try the arch by the grain stalls." Amara lifted her brows. "You think you're ready?" "I don't know, but I'm not afraid of them seeing me anymore." Amara said nothing, just reached over and placed her hand over Fania's, damp from the bowl. The room was still, lit only by the soft glow of their shared understanding. And outside, beyond the cracked walls and sun-bleached cloths, the city moved on, roaring, spitting, praising, forgetting. But inside, a girl had become a shape the world could no longer bend without consequence. The grain stalls buzzed even before the sun had crested the broken spine of the basilica. It was the part of the forum where the noise never slept, where wheat and barley changed hands in burlap sacks, and buyers measured weight by instinct more than scale. The air always smelled of flour and sweat, and that particular heaviness of early labor. Chickens darted between legs. Vendors barked over one another. Bread sellers passed with trays balanced on their heads. Fania stood just beneath the stone archway that separated the grain stalls from the leather vendors. She wasn't quite in the crowd, but she wasn't hiding either. Her back was straight. Her hands rested at her sides. Her sandals were laced carefully, the ribbon in her hair retied fresh that morning. Amara watched from across the street beneath the overhang of a shuttered fishmonger. Her arms were crossed loosely, the sun striking the top of her braid. She didn't call out, didn't offer encouragement. She only watched. Fania was doing what many could not. She was learning how to be seen without giving anything away. A man passed, tunic slightly too fine for this part of the city, eyes that moved too fast. He slowed as he approached Fania, said something Amara couldn't hear. Fania shook her head. Her hands remained at her sides. She didn't step back. The man lingered for a moment longer, then moved on, frustrated. Good, another man, taller, older. He said something too, this time gesturing. Fania listened, tilted her head slightly, replied, then gestured toward the temple steps as if redirecting him to another girl, another alley. He chuckled and left. Even better. An hour passed. Fania didn't move from her spot. She didn't falter. When a group of younger girls passed, loud, painted, laughing with too much performance, she didn't shrink. She simply watched them go, absorbing their rhythm. Eventually, Amara crossed the street. Not a bad place, she said quietly. Lots of movement, Fania replied. No one lingers too long. Did anyone get too close? No. One asked my price before he asked my name. And what did you say? I said my name costs more than he was carrying. Amara smiled. Clever. It felt right. They walked back together, not speaking. The streets were heating quickly. The city was waking fully now. More carts, more curses, more smoke rising from kitchens tucked behind cloth-covered thresholds. A beggar knelt near the crossroads, hands out, eyes cloudy. Fania dropped a coin. Amara said nothing. When they reached the room, Amara poured water, then handed Fania the basin. You stood well today. It felt less frightening, like the fear didn't live in my stomach anymore, more in my shoulders. That's where it lives in the second week, Amara said. By the third, it settles in your hips. Fania laughed, the sound bright, quick. And after that, you forget what it used to feel like. Inside the room, the air held the dust of the morning. Amara opened the window wider, letting the smells of the street drift in. Roasted grain, fig leaves burning, someone nearby boiling vinegar. A familiar ache twisted in her spine. She had worked too many days without pause. Fania noticed. Lie down. I'm fine. You're stiff. I said I'm fine. Fania reached for the cloth, dipped it in cool water, and pressed it gently against the back of Amara's neck. I know how to help, she said. You don't always have to carry the heavy end. Amara exhaled, a long, low breath. She didn't move for a while. That afternoon, Lucia visited. She swept into the room with her usual air of languid amusement, gold bangles clinking at her wrists, lips painted the color of ripe pomegranate. Well, she said, eyeing Fania. You're still upright and glowing. I survived the arch, Fania replied, smiling. Lucia raised an eyebrow at Amara. You've trained her well. I'm not done. You're never done, Lucia said, settling onto the mat like a queen resting between decrees. Lucia brought news. There was talk of a new magistrate taking office, one who had a reputation for cleanliness, for order. Rumors said he'd already begun ordering raids on unlicensed brothels south of the river. A girl had been taken 2 nights prior, not charged, just gone. Amara's face hardened. Where? Near the cattle pens, Lucia said. They say she wasn't registered. They say she bit a guard. They say a lot of things. Fania listened, eyes wide. Will they come here? Not yet, Amara said, but they will. Lucia leaned forward. You have your papers? Amara nodded. And the girl? Soon. Lucia studied them both. You need to be careful. This city doesn't mind using women like us, but it hates admitting we exist. When she left, the room felt smaller. Fania sat with her knees drawn up, her fingers tapping softly against her ankle. I want to register, she said. Amara looked up. Are you sure? I'm not, Fania said, but I don't want to disappear. Amara nodded slowly. We'll go tomorrow, she said, and that night when they lit the lamp, it burned steady, no flicker, no smoke, just light, clear and constant, illuminating a space where choice had finally entered the room. Not freedom, but the beginnings of it. Enough to matter, enough to hold. The morning they went to register, the city felt like it was holding its breath. There was no breeze. The clouds above Rome hovered like low smoke, thick and unmoving. Dust clung to everything, doors, faces, the hem of every tunic. Sounds, too, seemed muffled. The usual clang and bustle had been replaced by something quieter, alert, as though the very stone of the city understood what was about to happen. Fania had braided her hair tightly, the way Amara had shown her. No loose strands, no signs of hesitation. Her tunic was clean, though patched at the seams. Her sandals, still new enough to shine, clicked lightly against the stones as they walked. Amara wore her darker shawl, the one that covered her neck and shoulders but didn't hide her face. She had dressed as she did when she wanted to seem both forgettable and serious, neither available nor antagonistic. A woman who belonged, but did not linger. They said little as they made their way toward the praetor's office. Not the main one. Amara would never bring Fania through the central steps crowded with clerks and scribes and robed men shouting decrees. No, they went to a smaller annex near the edge of the Aventine, where the unspoken business of Rome was processed quietly and with little ceremony. The street leading to the annex was narrow and steep. It smelled of iron and sweat, a scent carried on the backs of the men who waited in line at the weapons registry one building over. Across from them, a bread seller shouted half-heartedly at passersby, the steam from her loaves rising like prayer smoke. Outside the door, a man waited with a slate in his hands. He didn't look up as they approached. "Name?" he asked. Fania hesitated. Looked to Amara. Amara spoke first. "Fania, no surname." "Status? Freedwoman. Last ownership? None registered." Amara replied calmly. "She's free, by circumstance." The man raised an eyebrow, glanced at Fania. "She'll need a sponsor." "I am," Amara said, and held out her own slate, a copy of her registration, years old but still valid. The man took it, scanned it with bored eyes, then handed it back. "Go inside. Wait by the second curtain." They stepped through a doorway carved with chipped floral reliefs into a dim corridor that smelled of parchment and damp cloth. A single oil lamp sputtered near the end. Women sat along the bench beside the wall. Young, old, painted, plain. Some held hands, some cried. One stared blankly ahead, lips moving without sound. Fania sat her back straight. She didn't touch Amara. She didn't need to. After a time, the curtain lifted and a scribe called her name. Fania stood. Amara touched her hand once briefly. "It's just ink and questions, nothing else." Fania nodded and stepped forward. The curtain fell. Amara waited. It took longer than expected. Long enough for the weight of her own memory to return. She remembered her first registration, the way the ink had felt too wet against her skin, the way the clerk hadn't looked her in the eyes, the way the stamp had thudded down like a final verdict. She had left that room changed, not because she had chosen something, but because someone else had put it in writing. When Fania returned, she held a small scrap of parchment, folded, stamped. Her expression was hard to read. They stepped outside before speaking. Amara looked at her. "Well?" Fania held out the paper. "It's done." The words hung in the air. For a moment, they didn't move. The street bustled around them again. The spell of the morning broken. A boy ran past carrying a basket of figs. A soldier cursed as his sandal caught on a cobble. Life resumed. Amara touched the edge of the parchment. "You don't have to show it to anyone if you don't want to. Just keep it safe." Fania nodded. "It felt like I was giving something up." "You were? But I also felt like I took something back." Amara smiled, just a little. "Then you've learned faster than I did." They walked home slowly, past the forum where merchants called out prices for wine and cloth, past the temple steps where a group of men argued loudly about the weather and the gods and the taxes imposed by some distant governor. Rome spun on, indifferent to the paperwork now tucked inside Fania's sash. That evening, Amara boiled lentils while Fania lit the lamp. The flame caught quickly. Later, they sat together with the door half open to let in the breeze. They said little. Only when the sky had turned to bruised plum did Fania speak. "Does this mean I'm one of them now?" "One of who?" "The others, the women with numbers, with licenses." Amara took a slow sip from her cup. "You're still you," she said. "The number doesn't own you, but it will protect you from disappearing." Fania exhaled. "That's what I want, not to disappear." "You won't," Amara said. "Not while I remember your name." In the hush that followed, Fania unfolded the paper once more. She looked at the seal, then folded it again with care. tucking it into the hollow beneath her mat. And as night unfurled across the rooftops, she laid her head on her arm and closed her eyes, not in surrender, but in quiet readiness for whatever Rome might ask of her next. The next few days passed like a low, steady river. No rapids, no stillness, only motion. Rome did what it always did. It breathed, it fed itself, it forgot. And within its shifting rhythm, Amara and Fania moved carefully, adjusting to a new balance neither of them had expected, but both had come to respect. Fania began walking more often, no longer hugging the edge of alleys. She chose her corners deliberately, shaded near the grain stalls or just outside the bathhouses where men emerged softened by steam and wine. She didn't go home with anyone, not yet, but she was no longer just observing. Amara stayed close during those walks, not beside her, but never far behind, blending into Rome's background like ivy on stone. She watched how Fania stood, how she lifted her chin when spoken to, how she smiled just enough to invite, but never enough to promise. By the fourth day, Fania returned from her morning watch with a silver coin and a faint mark at the edge of her neckline. Was it difficult? Amara asked as she poured water into a basin. No, Fania replied. It was kind. I don't think he wanted me to know his name. You don't need to, Amara said. Only the direction he walked when he left. Fania nodded. She removed her tunic and stepped into the wash basin without ceremony. Her arms bore no bruises. Her skin flushed slightly at the cheeks, except but not from shame. Amara handed her the cloth and a pinch of soap ash. The room smelled of wet clay and warm skin. Later, as the sun passed its highest point, they rested inside. The floor was cool. A single fly circled the rim of the water jar. Fania lay on her back, arms stretched out beside her. I didn't think I could do it, she said. Amara didn't look up from her stitching. But you did. I thought it would feel like being used. And did it? Fania hesitated. It felt like being seen, but just barely, like I was only visible in pieces. Amara set her needle down. That's how it begins, she said. First they see a hand or a curve or a laugh, never the whole. But the trick is, they never get to see all of you. That part you keep. They ate figs that night, soft, overripe, their sweetness leaking into their fingers. Amara offered Fania the last one without asking. The girl accepted it with a shrug and devoured it in 2 bites. The oil lamp flickered low. The streets outside were busy with festival talk, a harvest feast in 3 days' time. The temple priests had begun scattering flower petals across the thresholds of small shrines. Children ran past with garlands slung around their necks like trophies. Somewhere nearby, a man played a slow melody on a wooden flute, the notes curling into the air like thread. Fania watched the shadows dance on the wall. Do you think we'll ever leave? Leave where? Amara asked. This room, this street, this life. Amara leaned her head back against the wall, eyes half closed. Everyone leaves something eventually, she said, even if it's only a name. Fania was quiet for a while. Then she reached beneath her mat and pulled out her registration slip. The parchment was already creased at the corners, smudged slightly at the edges. I want to burn it someday, she said. You can, but not yet. No, Amara said, not yet. The air that night was still, warm. Their bodies no longer curled inward as they slept, but stretched slowly, naturally, into the open spaces between them. That was the real change. Not the coin, not the paper, but the way they had begun to rest in a world that had never wanted them to be at ease, to take up room, even in silence. Outside, the city shifted in its sleep, unaware that within one cracked room on the edge of Subura, 2 women had begun, quietly, carefully, to write their own history. Not in marble or ink, but in breath, in refusal, and in the simple act of staying. The morning of the harvest feast came with a sky so blue it looked painted. Rome, for once, felt almost clean. Garlands of olive branches and myrtle hung from doorways. White cloths were draped across the entrances of temples and shop fronts alike, fluttering like soft declarations of peace. The streets smelled of bread, honey, and the fat of early roasted lamb. Even the beggars had been fed, bread handed out by priests who muttered blessings with distracted hands. In Subura, it was the kind of day when everyone, even those who had been stepped on all year, stood a little straighter. Music poured from the taverns earlier than usual, and men laughed with the kind of ease they only allowed themselves during festivals or funerals. Amara braided her hair with a sprig of rosemary that morning. She wore a tunic the color of clay, simple but flattering, and fastened it with a bronze pin shaped like a serpent. It had belonged to a client once, years ago. He had left it behind after a night full of silence, not sex. She never saw him again, but she kept the pin. Some things wanted to stay, even if people didn't. Fania stood by the basin, splashing her neck with water. Her hair was down today, brushed and shining. She wore a light blue dress Amara had bartered for 2 weeks prior. It had a tiny rip near the hem, but Fania didn't care. It felt soft, like something that hadn't come from a punishment. "You'll be noticed today," Amara said, tying her shawl. Fania smiled. Let them. They didn't plan to work, not today. The feast wasn't a time for coin, not usually. It was a time for appearances, to be seen walking, laughing, adorned, to remind others that even women like them existed in color and light, not just shadow. The two of them walked together side by side through the broad paths leading toward the market square. Their pace was unhurried. Every few feet, they passed someone who called a greeting. Vendors, neighbors, an old man with no teeth who tipped his cap and winked at Amara. Lucia met them beneath the shade of a fig tree near the fountain. She was radiant. Gold earrings, a dress dyed the deep green of pine needles, and a fresh scarlet line painted just below each eye like war paint. She held a cup of watered wine and a pomegranate already cracked in one palm. "You look like queens of a ruined palace," she said, grinning. "Better a ruined palace than a borrowed one," Amara replied. They sat on a stone ledge, feet dangling over dust. Nearby, children danced in a loose circle, tossing laurel leaves into the air. The priest from the temple of Ceres passed by, his robes clean for once, his fingers curled around a staff topped with grain. Fania bit into a fig handed to her by a passing boy. She laughed as the juice ran down her chin and wiped it with the back of her hand. For a moment, she looked like someone untouched by cruelty, not just healed, unscarred. Lucia leaned in. "She's blooming." "She's beginning," Amara said. A young man approached then, dark curls, olive skin, tunic tied carelessly at the hip. He wasn't drunk yet, but close. He held a bundle of wildflowers and offered one to Fania. "For the most beautiful girl in Sabura." Fania took it, didn't blush. "You haven't seen all the girls yet." He blinked, thrown off, then laughed. "You're quick. I've had to be." He hovered a moment longer, unsure of whether to press his luck, then gave a clumsy bow and backed away. Fania twirled the flower between her fingers. Lucia watched her with a half smile. "You should keep an eye on that one." "I already am," Amara said. By afternoon, the heat softened and the streets grew louder. Drums echoed from the upper levels. Two acrobats flipped between posts near the bathhouse steps. A pair of women in red veils danced slowly in the shade, of their hips moving like water. Amara sat back, letting the noise pass over her. She hadn't felt this still in weeks, not empty, just full in a way that required no speaking. She looked at Fania, now laughing with a vendor who was pretending to argue over the price of grapes. Her smile had changed, less cautious, less rare. Amara thought of the early days, the broken sandals, the bruises, the way Fania had slept curled up as if trying to vanish into her own ribs. That girl still lived somewhere in her, but she was no longer in charge. This new version, the one in blue with honey on her lips, had claimed her place. As the sun began to sink and the shadows lengthened, the crowds thinned. Wine gave way to bread. Music slowed. The revelers drifted toward home or into the arms of someone warm. Fania and Amara walked back quietly. At the doorway to their room, Fania turned. "Thank you," she said, not looking at her. "For what?" "For not making me become someone I'm not. For waiting while I became someone I wanted to be." Amara touched her shoulder. "I didn't wait. I watched. And that's different." Inside, they undressed slowly, the fabric sticking to their skin with the last of the day's heat. Fania placed the flower in a shallow bowl beside the lamp. They lay on the mat without lighting the flame. The dark felt safe. And that night, Amara dreamed not of Rome's cruelty, nor of running. She dreamed of a house near a quiet stream, a window open to the sound of birds, a table with 2 cups and bread between them, and someone laughing, not to forget, but because they finally could. The day after the feast was always quieter. Rome wore a hangover like a second tunic, loose, wrinkled, impatient. The streets were slower, the vendors quieter, the laughter from the night before now reduced to the occasional groan behind half-shut doors. Leftover flower petals clung to gutters. Wine stains dotted the steps outside temples, and broken clay cups littered alleyways like discarded promises. Amara rose early anyway. She always did the day after. Celebration unsettled her. It reminded her too much of things that could vanish. The softness of shared joy, the illusion of safety. It was a fine perfume, sweet and fleeting. She had learned not to grow used to it. Fenia was still asleep, one arm flung across the mat, the flower from the young man's bundle tucked beneath her pillow, like a secret she wasn't ready to give up. Her breath came evenly, the barest whistle at the exhale. Amara didn't disturb her. Instead, she stepped out into the cool hush of morning and walked. The streets were nearly empty. The first carts of grain rolled quietly toward the upper market. A woman with a broom swept petals and ash from her doorway in slow, tired strokes. The city felt gentler today, not out of mercy, but exhaustion. Amara turned into a narrow passage near the base of the Kalian Hill, one lined with shuttered shops and overgrown balconies. She knew where she was going. She hadn't been there in over a year. The building looked smaller than she remembered, faded paint, crumbling edges. A sign hung crookedly above the threshold. Domus Salvii. It used to be a brothel, a legal one, not grand but well kept. Its owner had died during the last fever. Since then, it had changed hands more than once, each new proprietor less careful than the last. She stepped inside. The hallway smelled of vinegar and rosewater, an odd mixture of cleanliness and performance. A thin girl in a red sash glanced up from behind a table, her eyes rimmed in kohl, her mouth set. "We're not open yet," she said. "I'm not a client." The girl squinted. "Then what?" "I used to work here," Amara said softly. The girl leaned back, uncertain. "When?" "A long time ago, when Salvia ran it." The girl tilted her head. "You knew her?" Amara nodded. "She taught me how to say no." A beat of silence passed. Then the girl, less guarded now, motioned to a stool. "You want to sit?" Amara did. She looked around. The furniture was mostly the same, though more worn. The curtain between rooms had been replaced with a beaded partition, and the perfume in the air was cheaper. But the bones of the place were still there. "You thinking of coming back?" the girl asked. "No," Amara said, "just remembering. She was good to us," the girl offered, quieter now. "Or so the older ones say." "She was," Amara said. "She made the rules mean something." The girl glanced at the door, then back. "Not like that now." Amara didn't answer. She stood after a time, thanked the girl, and stepped back into the street. She didn't look back. On her way home, she passed the baths, where steam curled from under the archway, and men in tunics waited with towels slung over their shoulders. A boy ran between them, selling mint leaves. Somewhere, someone was laughing again, the kind of deep, belly-hollow laugh that only came after forgetting something painful. When she reached the room, Fenia was awake, sitting cross-legged on the mat, brushing the ends of her hair with her fingers. "You left early," Fenia said, not accusing, just noting. "I had something to remember," Amara replied. Fenia held up the flower from the night before. Its petals had begun to curl. "This is dying." "Most beautiful things do." "I don't want to keep it," Fenia said. "Then don't." Fenia stood, crossed the room, and dropped the flower into the basin. It floated there, weightless, turning slowly. She looked at Amara. "Tell me something true." Amara blinked. "Now? Yes, something from before, from your beginning." Amara sat, her back against the wall, her fingers laced around her knees. "When I was 15, she said, I stole a mirror from a merchant's cart, not for its silver, for the way it made my face look like it belonged to someone else." Fenia sat beside her. "Did you keep it?" "No," Amara said. "I gave it to another girl, one who couldn't look at herself without crying." "Did it help her?" "I don't know." They sat in silence. Then Fenia said, "I'm ready." "For what?" "To work." Amara looked at her for a long moment. "Are you sure?" "Yes." "Not because you're hungry?" "No." "Not because you feel you owe me?" "No," Fenia said, "because I can, and because I want what comes next." Amara nodded once. "Then we begin, properly." That night, they didn't go out. They stayed inside, preparing. Amara taught Fenia how to fold her dress in a way that made it drape softer over the shoulder, how to speak without smiling, how to smile without yielding, how to read the tilt of a man's stance in the shape of his silences. Fenia absorbed it all, a sponge growing its own shape. They lit the lamp late, long after the street had quieted, and beneath its golden glow, they practiced not seduction, but presence. And as they moved, speaking, stepping, pausing, Amara saw something she hadn't expected. Not a reflection of herself, not a pupil, but a future, different, brighter, and standing on her own. Fenia's first night was warm and windless, the kind of Rome night that felt almost too quiet, as though the city itself were listening from behind its stone facades. The sky, though moonless, shimmered with a faint blush of stars, faint and scattered like ash across a blackened hearth. She wore the clay-colored dress, the one Amara had mended 3 times, carefully reinforcing its seams without sacrificing the drape. A thin cord belted it at the waist, just enough to suggest softness without provocation. Her hair was half-pinned, a style Amara had taught her to signal approachability without exposure. Painted lips, not red but rose, and eyes rimmed only with sleep, not cold. Amara didn't walk beside her that night. She watched from the shadows, near the columned arcade just beyond the wine shop, a familiar post carved with names no one remembered. She leaned against it like a priestess might lean against her altar, watchful, patient, expectant. Fenia stood beneath the olive tree in the courtyard between the bathhouse and the tavern. The breeze moved the leaves above her, casting shifting patterns of shadow across her arms. She stood without fidgeting. She didn't hide her hands. She didn't avert her gaze when passers-by looked her way. She simply existed, with calm, with purpose, with choice. The first man approached within the hour. A trader, perhaps, a little older, hands too clean for heavy labor, eyes that scanned the space before settling on her. He said something Amara couldn't hear. Fenia tilted her head, answered. He laughed. They stood for a few moments more. She touched his arm once, then shook her head. He left. Amara exhaled. Another came later, this one younger, nervous. She let him speak longer. He offered her something in his hand, a small pouch maybe, or a folded token. She accepted it. They walked together slowly toward the small inn at the edge of the square. Amara didn't follow. She didn't need to. She knew the inn. She knew the way the doors opened there, quietly, without flourish. She knew which rooms had clean sheets and which ones to avoid. She had chosen the corner near the olive tree precisely because of its distance from danger. She stood there a while, listening to the muffled chatter of tavern goers, to the scrape of sandals on stone, to the breeze combing through the leaves like fingers in long hair. When Fenia returned, her walk was steady, her braids slightly looser, her shoulders still square. She stepped into the room and set the pouch on the shelf before removing her sandals. She didn't speak right away. She poured water into the basin, rinsed her hands, and splashed her face. Amara sat cross-legged on the mat, watching. Fenia finally turned. He asked if I'd done this before. What did you say? I said yes, Amara nodded. Was it true? Fenia met her eyes. By the time I answered, it was. She sat across from Amara. The lamp between them flickered, casting long gold lines across the walls. I didn't feel afraid, she said. Good. I felt in control. You were. Fenia smiled. Not the bright smile of a girl, but something deeper, wiser. Her face had changed subtly. Not hardened. No, that would come later, and only if she allowed it. But tonight, her features held the first trace of that thing Amara knew all women like them earned eventually. Sovereignty. They shared bread and olives. The meal was simple, but it tasted rich. Afterward, Fenia unwrapped the token the man had given her. A small carved charm, bone, polished, shaped into the form of a fish. A crude engraving of a wave traced the curve of its side. He said it was for luck, Fenia whispered. Then keep it, Amara replied. She watched Fenia turn it in her palm, again and again, like she was memorizing its shape through touch. Much later, after the lamps had been snuffed, they lay in the warm hush of the room. Outside, the city creaked and shifted in its sleep. Distant laughter, the rattle of a gate. Somewhere a cat howled and then was quiet. Fenia's voice came through the dark, low and sure. Do you think it will always feel like this? Amara turned her head, though she couldn't see her. No, she said honestly. Sometimes it will be harder. Sometimes it will feel like you've lost something you can't name. And then you remember this night, the beginning, the feeling of choosing, and you rebuild from there. Fenia was quiet. Amara reached across the mat not to take her hand, but just to brush the backs of her fingers. You are not what they see, she whispered. You are what you hold back. The dark held them both, warm and full and forgiving. Outside, Rome turned its face toward another day, But inside the room, beneath a cracked ceiling and two shared breaths, something rare had been born. Not innocence, not power, but selfhood, hard-won, quiet and real, and it would never be taken again.